The story begins in the border territory of Castle, a place where drought has erased all hope. Dehydrated bodies are scattered throughout the village, while empty wells leave the fields dead and withered, the ground cracked and lifeless, covered by the remains of livestock that now only serve as a feast for scavengers. In the midst of such hopelessness, the people only tried to escape, but the Margrave of Castle considered this a betrayal, sending his troops to punish them, spilling the blood of innocents who could barely flee. Among them was a small, barefoot boy who tripped on the dry ground and fell at the mercy of the soldiers, who smiled sadistically. The little one only begged to be saved from his fate, but his blood was mercilessly shed. Leading these brutal acts was the son of Margrave Castle, a powerful mage in whose veins ran the blood of divine kings. From his arrogance, he looked upon the cursed village with disdain and disgust, berating a woman who was caring for her child, claiming that it was thanks to the grace of the nobles that she was still alive, and accused them of daring to escape after just a few days without rain. The woman only begged the psychopath to spare the little ones. His response was to brutally run her through in front of her son, who saw up close the blade that orphaned him. This annoyed the mage, as they had interrupted his fun, so he thought about how to make it all more entertaining. Thus, he rejoiced before a macabre scene. Men with ropes around their necks were being held up by their children or wives, who struggled to keep them alive. Just the kind of sadistic fun the mage was looking for. At that moment, a guard drags another man into the game, although this one had been stabbed, so the mage wonders how to keep him alive long enough to be entertaining. Meanwhile, a young woman begs him to leave the man alone, but he shoves her away harshly, leaving her helpless on the ground, sobbing uncontrollably, watching as the soldiers hang the man by his waist, forcing the girl to hold him up as best she can. Although the weight almost overcomes her, the mage sarcastically congratulates her, reminding her that without her effort, the man's veins would have already collapsed. The madman was interrupted by the arrival of a tall, strong man, who warned him not to treat so lightly the blood that ran through his veins. This was the renowned Lord Sabek, the mage's fencing instructor. Castle. He wasn't the least bit afraid of the mage, even doubting if he was worthy of carrying that divine blood. After these acts, Castle knew his secret would remain intact, as long as no one revealed what happened, claiming that it was just a punishment for having stained his honor by trying to escape his lands, asking if a holy knight, recognized by the king's church, would have the audacity to tell what happened, questioning if he would dare to raise his voice against someone of noble blood. Beck made it clear that no secret stays hidden forever, while a guard waited for his master's order to act. But the mage chose to ignore him, asking for a whip to continue hurting the young woman. Beck seriously watched the madman's brutal lashes, who ecstatically kept striking and sadistically congratulated the woman for holding firm. When he was finished, the mage walked past his master, cynically asking him to smile a little. Beck only contemplated the gruesome scene, seeing how, by afternoon, the others lay lifeless, hanging from the tree branches, except for the wounded man, still held by his fiancée Safi, who clung to hope even though he begged her to let him go. Night fell and Safi, exhausted, fainted, only to be woken up by Beck, who tried to give her food so she could regain her strength, although she could barely form any words. At dawn, he watched over her with a melancholic gaze before leaving. Risking punishment from his master, he asked her to stop holding her fiancé, since he had used a stick to prop him up, but as she stood up, Safi knocked it over to continue her task, completely determined. But before he left, she wanted to know the knight's name so she could beg the heralds to spare her beloved's life. Beck was confused, as he knew the heralds as soulless assassins of the heretical and unholy, with whom the woman apparently had contact. Noticing she averted her gaze, he assumed it was just a simple legend. Besides, Castle had 20 well-armed soldiers and even himself, who also possessed the divine blood of a mage. However, Safi insisted it didn't matter, as the heralds were also mages and earned their name by wiping out the heralds of the divine blood. Beck thought she was delirious from the trauma, but he ended up giving her his name, clarifying that he wasn't doing it to beg for mercy, and that if the heralds really came, they would fight with all their might. Then he left her alone, promising to return that night. She, with a vacant stare, looked at a symbol at her feet, knowing she only had to wait 2 days. During the night, Safi remembers when her fiancé gave her a coin, telling her it was linked to the clan of the heralds and was part of the same legend her father used to tell her when she was a child. He convinced her that the coin could summon the soulless beings, though he also warned her that if anyone found out she had it, she would be executed without hesitation, before giving her an affectionate kiss on the cheek, while she pushed him away, annoyed by how sappy he was and because he was giving her something far too dangerous. He insisted it was just an insurance policy in case something ever happened, explaining that she had to draw a triangle on the ground and place the coin in the center to summon a herald. Safi always thought she would never have to use it, but now she had performed the ritual, clinging only to faith as she held her fiancé, thinking that she just had to hold on until they arrived, even though her body was no longer responding. Her energy drains away and she finally collapses to the ground, strengthless and lifeless. Meanwhile, Castle's troops were amusing themselves, wasting water to cool off, while Beck watched the sun, bearing the unusual heat. Just then, Castle showed up and told him to have some fun. Beck didn't understand what the point was in ruining a town that paid taxes, but Castle couldn't care less. He only saw them as potential criminals. This started to infuriate Beck, who knew they could have evacuated them to fertile lands, but for Castle, that meant tainting those lands with people who had already ruined their own agriculture and then tried to escape. Convinced of his own sadism, Castle claimed that, according to the teachings of the church, agriculture also depended on the king's blessing and that if they had suffered this drought, it was because they were faithless. Beck, however, saw this as a very loose interpretation. Someone had made the land fertile and someone had caused the drought, but for Castle, the only important thing was giving everyone what they deserved, exploiting the town and then discarding it. But he always gave the knight the option to betray him and save them. However, he just remained silent. Sometime later, Beck returned to the desolate town, heading straight for that tree. From a distance, he saw that the woman had fallen, unable to hold on any longer as he approached the scene. He understood that even if the heralds had truly arrived, her effort would have been for nothing. Then he reacted, sensing a presence behind him, an apparition that managed to place its sword at his neck. That herald warned him not to move or he would be eliminated. Beck easily noticed from his phantom technique that indeed, he was facing a herald and didn't hesitate to reveal his identity as a knight of the king's church. The herald assumed Beck wasn't his contractor, since it would be truly sad if someone from the church were that desperate. Those words struck Beck's ego, although the herald clarified that he didn't want to fight, since he was only there for a contract with the girl who had summoned him, who was now dead, so he didn't know what to do. Beck agreed to talk to him, as long as he put away his weapon and kept his distance. The herald accepted and moved like a shadow, backing away at great speed, leaving Beck in shock, who was impressed by his skill. The herald, for his part, respected Beck for having the courage to face him. Considering him brave, Beck asked if he was a mage, but the masked man denied it, claiming he was the only one in the clan who wasn't. This left the knight confused, considering what he had just witnessed. However, the guy simply explained that he possessed superhuman energy. Beck asked him, then what his position was within the clan. The herald politely introduced himself as Asadin, the last of the 108 spirits of the Emperor's heralds. To Beck's surprise, he was one of the lowest ranks in the clan, something hard to believe, considering the power he had shown. Still, the guy told him to keep his promise. And so, they both looked over the town as Asadin finished listening to the story. Everything seems settled, just when an owl lands on his shoulder and informs him that since the contractor died, he can collect his payment for free. Beck is shocked to see an animal that can talk, but it doesn't end there. The owl gives Asadin another mission, so they have to hurry. Even so, Beck doesn't think it's right to abandon the request just because the girl died, which baffles the herald, since his group would suffer the consequences. But Beck, full of confidence, claims he will defeat him right there and then. His rival bursts out laughing at the response, thinking that a sword that stays silent in the face of injustice could never touch him. The comment throws the knight off, who remembers that woman. So what Asad perceives in his gaze isn't anger at him, but at himself for having remained silent in the face of injustice. Beck, annoyed, tells him to shut up, but the guy instead starts talking to him about the myths and legends hidden in the constellations of the night sky, though the knight didn't understand what that had to do with anything. Asadin, looking up at the sky, explained that humans had different ways of observing it. Some saw heroes from myths and others just a twinkling light, alluding to the woman's fate, implying that Beck saw it differently than the other soldiers, but the knight claimed he was no different. Worse still, he felt helpless for not having done anything. Gazing at his reflection in the sword, he remembered his duty to revere those with divine blood. Asadin made it clear he didn't want to fight him, acknowledging what he had felt for the woman, so he simply lowered the fiancé, and then picked up the woman, expecting Beck to get him a shovel to give them a proper burial. This terrified the knight, as it would ruin his boss's plan to leave the couple as an agonizing example of his power. Beck trembled, knowing that if he did it, he would earn Castle's wrath. While Asadin began to dig with his bare hands, Beck watched him from behind, gripping his weapon tightly, before plunging it into the ground and joining the masked man in the task, slowly building the graves. Once finished, they placed a cross and Asadin prayed for their souls. Beck recognized in that prayer a rite of the clan of rescuers, which revealed the boy as some kind of traitor. However, Asadin maintained that if he didn't defend what was right, his life would be meaningless. Beck then asked him what he kept of his old faith. Asadin didn't get to answer, as the master Beck revered was approaching, accompanied by all the troops led by Castle, who scoffed, saying that if he had asked for the pretty peasant girl, that he would have given her to him. Beck realized he had been discovered and was now facing 20 high-level soldiers he couldn't defeat, though luckily Castle was more interested in finding out who the guy aiming straight at his army was, letting loose the first arrow that flew past the soldiers, hitting the farthest one directly in the eye, leaving everyone shocked. Even Beck, impressed by the marksmanship, witnessed the second shot. The arrow flew low towards the knights who had taken position with their shields, confident they could stop it. However, one of them began to back away in pain upon feeling the impact, dropping his shield, which was split in two, as the arrow lodged itself in his head, leaving him agonizing on the ground. Terror spread among all the soldiers as they witnessed the power and precision of the attack. It was then that Asadin answered Beck's question, admitting that he supported the message of the rescuers, that a person is not defined by their birth, but by their beliefs and actions, preparing his next shot, which made it clear that someone born with divine blood, but who massacred a town, could not be considered noble, with his bow aimed directly at Castle, who watched furiously, yelling at Beck to finish the bastard, but Asadin didn't even give him time to speak. With a huge leap, he landed silhouetted against the moon and released his next shot, hitting its mark perfectly, and immediately he fired another and another. The knights felt it was an unstoppable rain of arrows, though as soon as gravity did its job, they thought they could catch him, but Asadin simply used their own spears as platforms to jump again and continue shooting. Each arrow lodged in their eyes or between their victim's legs. One of them just grazed the head of Castle, who immediately saw his fallen soldiers and understood that none of the shots were meant to kill them, but to permanently disable them, incapacitated them, aiming for vital spots on their faces or legs. The furious mage demanded to know his name, and Asadin gave it to him just as he appeared behind him with a menacing aura, making it clear that he was a herald. The mage and his soldiers were shocked, however. Before the boy could attack, he ran out of arrows. Koso noticed, but he barely got a word out before taking a devastating blow that sent him to the ground. Asadin, preparing himself, took off his quiver to fight without the extra weight. Among the wounded soldiers, the ones still standing attacked him, but he knocked them out with a single blow. He picked up his sword, warning them that he had already thinned their numbers with his arrows, and that now he could handle them, inviting them to come at him. Before continuing, he used another arrow to castrate the guy he had just taken down. Everyone was terrified to see his thing for castration, which made them hesitate to attack. All of this was being observed by the owl, and as time passed, it showed how. Asadin walked triumphantly among the wounded and castrated soldiers, apologizing to his final target, Gozul, for making him wait. This guy was crawling away desperately, feeling for the first time a little of the pain he himself had caused. Desperate, the mage managed to turn around and activated a blinding light from his hands. The flash nearly blinded his own badly wounded men, but it did nothing to Asadin. Even so, Gozul tried to convince him, claiming that his magic was proof of the superior blood running through his veins. Asadin responded by spilling some of it with a quick slash. Although it was just a small wound, it caused him unbearable pain, and he couldn't understand what had been done to his body. Gozul writhed in pain while Asadin looked on amused, reminding him that he had already decided this. And so, the herald approached the humiliated mage who begged him, offering everything his family to buy. But Asadin made it clear that he was standing before a herald. The mage's sobs intensified as he begged Beck for help, who couldn't do much since he was still half-blinded by the light. Gozul's pleading turned to rage, clinging to the belief that as a noble from a sacred bloodline, he shouldn't be punished for what he did to mere commoners. Asadin heard his words and agreed, agreeing that he should live, but not in the way Gozul expected. He granted him a life full of gratitude, because on that day, with a swift flick of his dagger, he left him in darkness forever. And so it all ended, with Asadin, thinking that even without a client, he had been very kind to carry out this job in the name of the Emperor's law. Beck couldn't let a heretic who spoke of the Emperor just walk away, no matter how many righteous deeds he performed. Asadin, genuinely surprised, noticed how different Beck was from the other knights of the king. Beck took this as an insult, but Asadin actually meant it as a compliment, since the other knights he'd met were just scoundrels, kicked out of their homes over inheritance issues. Beck tried to contradict him, but the boy wouldn't let him, assuring him he didn't think Beck could even keep up. Then, with a single movement, he vanished before his very eyes, leaving his voice echoing in the air, hoping that fate would allow them to meet again. The story of that day boiled down to one fact. Nobody was even able to touch the herald, Asadin. While the knights suffered multiple casualties, with Beck being the only one without any injuries, his pride certainly was. He ended up admitting he fit that same description of the king's knights, cursing himself for it. Although upon seeing the sunrise, he felt like a huge weight had finally been lifted off his shoulders. Meanwhile, a group of peasants was trying to convince Lord Mangrave to exempt them from taxes as they were in the midst of a monumental famine. The starving men walked like zombies through the streets, and their village was overrun by thieves and monsters. But to Mangrave, their request was just shameless. He thought that if he agreed, they would even ask him for food next. His words struck the village leader, who begged for mercy for his collapsing village. Mangrave, with a sadistic gaze that surpassed even his own son's, told them he had decided to help those vile-blooded beings. The men were shocked until they heard the condition. If they failed to meet it, they would all be executed. With terror taking hold of them, Mangrave then used his magic to materialize the quest they would have to undertake a page from a grimoire. The peasants insisted they had no idea what he was talking about, but he assured them that even ignoramuses like them could find it if they put their minds to it, promising that if they succeeded, he would not only exempt them from taxes for 3 years, but also give them 50 bushels of wheat, barley, and oats. The offer startled everyone. One of the men asked for at least the name of the grimoire to start their search. Mangrave was basically sending them after a copy of the Divine King's book. Later, Mangrave was waiting on his throne when, from behind a curtain, a huge serpent slithered out and stared at him intently. Suddenly, the creature transformed into a woman, a curvy one at that, who scolded him for using the book's name. To him, however, it was just nonsense, since everyone was already after the grimoire, and as long as they managed to get at least 1 page, that was enough for him. Then, he asked what she was doing there. She made herself comfortable to tell him that his son had been attacked in the eastern region. Mangrave considered it impossible with Beck present, but the woman told him it had been a herald. That didn't surprise him, as he knew that if they wanted to break their curse, they also needed the king's book. He then asked about his son's condition, who had apparently been blinded and castrated. That struck Mangrave's ego, and he decided that in revenge, they would attack the Herald Clan. The Serpent Witch thought about going to see the commander to coordinate, but he quickly grabbed her and threw her onto his lap, thinking that now that his son had been castrated, he would need to sire another one. Meanwhile, under the infernal desert sun, Asadin trudged on with almost no water, complaining to the owl on his shoulder for making him travel so fast. The bird was surprised that he would insult the bearer of the emperor's voice, but the boy was still annoyed that the emperor had let himself be taken out without a plan, leaving them now with some half-baked scheme for heretics. He also griped that because the owl wanted to show off, it had made him travel without water, without luggage, and with food that would only constipate him to death. The owl had no choice but to apologize, but it promised to get him a servant soon. Asadin, however, was more worried about what was in front of him. A ghostly fire appeared, taking the form of the souls of the people hanged by Castle. He asked them to cross over to the afterlife, since they had already settled their grudges and were now in a spiritual no-man's land. However, they remained there with Safia pointing to a well. Asadin thanked them, but asked them to rest in peace. Still, he was thrilled at the prospect of drinking some water. However, upon pulling up the bucket, he found a page from the grimoire, and so we learn a bit about the history of the Herald Clan, a race known as the Aragaza who arrived on the Weber's continent by crossing a great typhoon from another continent, encountering the 8 divine kingdoms of the Yegas, who each ruled over their respective territories. However, in that era only one managed to monopolize the thrones, subjugating the rest of his siblings. This was Emperor Yesla, who sought to eradicate any trace of competition, while the Aragaza were looking for a place to settle. Thus, they reached an agreement in which the emperor would grant them the grimoires of the Yellow Bird's song, and a spirit called the emperor's voice in exchange for becoming his heralds. In this way, the outsiders stained their hands with the blood of the gods, becoming the emperor's executioners and ending the life of any noble who dared to prosper. Over time, the emperor eventually died and the continent was once again divided into the 8 kingdoms. Since then, the Aragaza were despised and rejected, earning the name Soulless Herald. To make matters worse, they didn't expect that the contract they signed would transcend death, keeping them prisoners of the emperor's laws and commands forever, or at least until now, when Asadin finds a page from the Divine King's grimoire, assuming it's part of the source of the emperor's power. Seeing it as a gift from the ghosts who could finally rest in peace, once everyone was gone, he asked the emperor's voice if they could escape the curse with it, although for the owl it wasn't a curse, but an honorable duty. Asadin doesn't feel entirely good about finding it, even though he knows it's what all the heralds desire, to fulfill the duties of the contract, gather 100,000 gold coins, and get their hands on the book of the Divine King to break the curse. Still, it worries him that news of the book might spread, remembering that it was his own father who was responsible for scattering it, although he can't think clearly due to dehydration. Because of this, he also doesn't notice someone following him. It's 2 kids who have him in their sights. The leader of the duo aims at him, convinced he's a talentless traitor, recalling that the rumors say he's cursed for being unable to use magic. Her companion nods, reinforcing the idea, while she adds cruel and out-of-context taunts, like that he wets the bed, that he doesn't even know how to tie ropes, believing he's a useless bum incapable of fulfilling the role of a herald. However, her companion thought the girl named Miriam was already going overboard with the hate, and the boy asked her to turn down the job offer and go home. But the girl, instead of doing so, wanted to test the skills of the useless herald. The boy knew they shouldn't attack a superior, but Midian didn't care. She coveted Asadin's position, although she wasn't planning on taking him out either, so she decided to shoot blunt arrows. Her companion tried to convince her to leave, reminding her that Asadin was the disciple of the great master Cassus, but the stubborn girl wouldn't listen, disdating him not only for being the son of a traitor, but because according to her inflated ego, he held a position that should have been hers. Feeling determined, she took her shot from up high, which seemed to be heading straight for the target, even though she hid before seeing the result. Hoping everything had gone well, when she peeked out again from the rocks, a pebble came flying and hit her right on the forehead. Her companion worried about her, while the herald appeared on the rock in an instant, annoyed by the attack. The smug girl tried to play it off, saying it was just a little hello, though she couldn't believe the guy had actually caught her arrow and put it in his quiver. Asadin, for his part, was not happy at all, so he asked for their names. The girl introduced herself as Midian of Ether, while the boy was Ismail. It seemed they were now his new assistants. However, our protagonist was annoyed by the attempted attack. The arrogant girl tells him she saw he was unarmed and was just offering him a couple of arrows. Asadin just looks at them like kids playing away from home and tells them to go back. Midian, feeling slighted, reminded him of her lineage, but he cut her off to remind her that among heralds, bloodline didn't matter. The attack had been disrespectful, and he asked if she wanted to find out the consequences. Midian, more nervous than before, began to doubt if he was really the same man everyone made fun of, calling him an idiot. Asadin demanded an apology and respect, either as his servant or as his enemy. Left with no choice, Midian swallowed her pride and apologized. The herald accepted, warning her that in the real world a weapon shouldn't be used like a toy. He agreed not to file a bad report and sent them on their way, as he didn't need them. However, before they could leave, he asked for some water. Midian didn't let him finish, demanding a duel. As much as Ismail tried to stop her, the proud girl thought that even though Asadin wasn't the idiot from the rumors, she couldn't chicken out now, so she challenged him to a duel for the position of herald. Ismail was crying while Asadin, genuinely confused, thought their master Ariel had definitely been a bad influence on them, although he understood that Midian might covet his position, but perhaps the girl didn't fully grasp what would happen if she lost. She, however, was willing to give him everything she had, even her life if it came to that. This confused the herald even more, who knew that humoring her was a problem, but letting them see him as weak was an even bigger one. So he urged Midian to back down, reminding her that even with his bad reputation he hadn't gotten that position by mistake, but she instead began to walk away to take 100 paces to start the duel. The owl, representing the Emperor's voice, ended up accepting the challenge on his behalf, leaving the two kids in shock, while Asadin didn't even understand when he had agreed. Ismail, however, understood that with the Emperor's voice as a witness, there was no turning back, and Midian was determined to win. Sometime later, all that initial fire had fizzled out as the herald was drinking some water, while the two kids were completely beaten up, especially Midian. However, the most stunned one was Ismail, still baffled by the move he had witnessed, recalling the start of the duel when Asadin sacrifices power for speed and fires rocks in every direction. Midian barely manages to block them, protecting herself with magic, but the barrage doesn't stop. Now, rocks are curving in from different angles, and the blonde barely manages to dodge them, with each one passing closer and grazing her skin. According to Ismail, this is a technique called the yellow snarl, an ability Asadin can use even without magic. What surprises Ismail the most happens next, when Midian withstands everything thrown at her. The final brutal shot reveals the protagonist's position, which the girl takes advantage of, lunging at him at full speed, convinced she could end it all with a huge slash of her dagger. She thinks she managed to take him out, or so she thought, until the figure began to fade away, revealing it was just an illusion. Surprised, she barely reacts thanks to Ismail's warning, turning around to defend herself, but Asadin deflected her arm, leaving her wide open, and landed a brutal punch that completely shattered a nearby rock. Ismail cried out in helplessness, running furiously towards him for daring to do that to a girl of noble blood. However, the owl put an end to the duel, making it clear that because she lost, Midian was now the herald's property, as was Ismail for getting in the middle of it. Back in the present, Midian, unable to cope with the shame, pulled out a dagger with the intention of using it on herself, only to be stopped by a mysterious force. Asadin had already expected this reaction, watching as she fell to her knees, completely humiliated, while Ismail tried to help her. Asadin made it clear to them that by losing the duel, she couldn't even die unless her owner decided so. In disbelief that they didn't even know that, Asadin considers them a pair of fools, further increasing the girl's humiliation. But for the herald, that's enough. Handing back the water, he tells the two kids he'll release them from the deal, who react in very different ways, while Asadin tries to go on his way, though he's now saddled with two clingy ticks he can't seem to get rid of. It's all because Midian refuses to be rejected so easily and insists that he has won a beautiful and talented slave. This just makes Ismail cringe. Asadin chooses to ignore the beautiful part, but blurts out that if she were really as talented as her master, she wouldn't have lost. And as for the slave thing, he advises her to stop challenging just anyone if she doesn't want to end up under the command of some pervert. Ismail, watching all of this, understood that despite being a herald, Asadin was kind and cared about them. That seemed to frustrate Midian even more. Or rather, it seemed the Herald's aura had awakened in her teenage hormones. But for now, we have a bit more about the service contract that the Herald Clan signed with the Emperor back in the day. That pact granted them status and honor, but it ended up becoming a curse they couldn't escape from. However, it seemed the path to breaking it began when the Herald Clan intervened in the War of Succession for the Terrazar Kingdom. As a reward for their participation, they were given a copy of the Divine King's grimoire with which they could break the curse. However, everything was ruined when a traitor stole it, although they managed to capture him and threatened him in every way possible. Acre remained firm in his silence. Over time, that stubbornness caused them to once again lose hope of being free, since Acre had scattered the book across the mountain range. His punishment was to become the first victim of the curse, condemned to give birth from his own body to two twins, one of whom was Rael, a woman destined to become the most powerful in the clan. Herald Asadin, who turned out to be the complete opposite. Midian then understood that the rumors about him were very wrong, but the one in a worse spot was the MC himself, who couldn't manage to shake them off. Although the kids pretended to be going in the same direction, using an official letter as a pretext, Asadin took the letter and started reading it, realizing that they would overlook his poor report management as long as he obtained pieces of the grimoire, wondering if the kids knew about that. But Miriam claimed she knew everything, even about her traitor father. Ismail, feeling awkward, stepped on her foot so she wouldn't be indiscreet. In revenge, she started squishing his cheeks while Asadin informed them that they would have to take a detour to see the regional chief. Miriam, showing a softer side, asked to stay on the same path, to which Asadin agreed, seeing her more and more as a girl in love, while Ismail watched in great pain from his swollen cheeks. Sometime later, the journey continued until they had to rest. When they woke up to keep moving, the kids could barely stay awake as he led them to a spring to resupply, but they were interrupted by a group of bandits. Asadin preferred to pay rather than fight, but the bandits wanted something he wasn't willing to give. While the MC hoped they would negotiate, the men prepared for a fight, ready to finish him off and take the girl. Sometime later, after 3 operations, the other 3 bandits begged for forgiveness, assuring him they weren't with the previous group and that they were just recruits sent by Mangle Castle on a pointless quest. They were grateful to have run into someone as noble as Asadin. Midian thought they were lying, but the MC trusted them, knowing they weren't in a sector dominated by bandits. Midian didn't care. She thought they should be silenced, and Ismail reminded her that was the protocol. But Asadin maintained that he didn't kill without reason and decided to give them another chance, for which the bandits were grateful. The boy was surprised, as he never thought a herald would refuse to kill, but immediately Asadin got serious and unleashed a brutal punch on one of the bandits, knocking him unconscious and shattering his eye. He warned the others to stay still or they might die. Confused, they listened as he explained he would let them go, but only after inflicting so much damage that they could never harm anyone again, even if they regretted it later. The kids seemed to agree, at least in a manner of speaking. And so, there remained 3 fixed and one-eyed bandits who swore to get revenge on the ungrateful MC next time. The first one ended up losing his head. The others barely had time to react before being captured by a giant ogre who threw them into a food sack. The monster took others as well, while leaving some scraps as snacks for its pets, the goblins. The trail of bodies led it directly to a human village that would soon become its personal buffet. As the group continues on their way, Miriam admits that, although at first she thought Asadin was being soft, she now sees the benefits of his methods with the bandits. The MC states that losing an eye is much more serious than they thought, turning them into the victims now, hoping they will learn now that their position has changed. Ismail admires how he punished them, but also how he gave them a chance to cleanse their souls, although something still bothers Asadin, because the Mangrave is looking for the copy of the king's book, and Ismail recalls that Castle lost his position on the throne and thinks he might want to use it to rise through the kingdom's ranks. Asadin senses the situation is dangerous and decides, to do it, he must remove the mask that identifies him as a herald. In that instant, the kids freeze in shock upon discovering that his eyes are sealed by a massive scar, leaving them bewildered as they don't understand how he can be so strong without being able to see, and the truth is, not even he knows. Since he was a child, he could always see without relying on his eyes. Midian tried to say something but couldn't find the words. He asked Sadi to just spit it out, so she confessed that in her mind, he was a handsome man who had suffered an unfortunate accident, feeling that at least his face wasn't marred by ugly eyes. Ismail tried to get her to stop her nonsense, while Asadin was experiencing déjà vu, because that was the exact same thing the one who gave him the scar had said, his own sister, Arael. That, when they were children, she decided to make that cut on him so it would look like a scar and not empty sockets, which in retrospect had at least given him an excellent disguise to go unnoticed, especially now that he had company. And so they arrived at the town, or rather, at the enormous line to get in. It stretched far beyond the main gate, to a place Asadin hadn't visited in a long time, which was the starting point of the Imperial Road. Midian saw it as the perfect place to start their adventure. Asadin reminded them of their cover stories. He was a blind pilgrim that these two had latched onto. Even so, he suddenly had a major question, nicknaming Ismail Puppy Eyes. He asked if the town was like this when they passed through before, as he watched the guards practically shake down, the poor people trying to get in. Asadin thought that if they were being so meticulous, they were surely looking for something. At that moment, the old man in front of Asadin in line, noticing his condition and how difficult it must be to travel like that, tells him that copies of the king's book have appeared all over the world, thanks to a herald who spread them around. For that reason, Castle's men are searching for them relentlessly. Asadin thinks there must be more idiots like Castle out there, and feels the weight in his pockets, carrying the very thing the guards are looking for. Suddenly, a man shouts, "Break the line's silence," desperately demanding the guards return the money they took from him during the so-called inspection, as he needs it to feed his family. The response is a solid punch that leaves him on the ground, while the knights mock him and say they'll check his money in case he's hiding any pages. Then, a little girl steps in and calls them thieves. At this, the guards threaten her without hesitation, but her father protects her as best he can, only to receive another brutal blow, leaving the little girl trembling with fear for her father. Seeing this, the aspiring herald's blood boiled with fury, ready to fight, but Asadin stopped them, and at that moment, a man arrived, accompanied by soldiers, whispering something in the guards' ears that put them on high alert. They quickly began to gather their belongings, leaving everyone confused except for Asadin, who explained to the villagers that an ogre was approaching. For that very reason, the soldiers closed the town gates, unleashing panic among those left outside. They pounded hard on the gates, begging to be let in, but their pleas were ignored. Instead, the guards began to move the important people into carriages. Among them was the bastard son of Margrave Castle Tarkef, who hoped they would lock the gates up tight, so he could escape, now that he had confirmed there were no pages of the book there. Then, the leader of the town guard asked Tarkef what he would do. He replied that they should focus on defending him, trusting in his great one-day training to survive. His words only terrified the leader more, who begged him to at least let in those who were outside. Tarkef scoffed, assuring him they didn't stand a chance. Though coming from a coward, that meant little. At least the leader got authorization to command the defense. Meanwhile, in the monster's sack, the one-eyed bandit trembled with fear, believing he was going to die. From there, he could see the huge and hungry horde of the ogre's goblins heading straight for the town. And from the top of the towers, the watchmen were terrified. Below, the villagers were resigned and the guards were ready to fight. After nightfall, a caravan of refugees was making its way as best it could down a dark road. Just then, an elderly woman returned to warn the main group about how difficult things could get up ahead, giving a lantern to Ismail so he could protect his little sister and his uncle. Asadin was not at all happy that his cover was turning into a family trip, but he had no choice, given that people treated him better when he pretended to be blind. Recalling how the guard leader had come out to warn him that the nobles had fled, but that he had to stay to protect his home. Thus, he also asked some villagers to stay and fight while the others evacuated. And so, the enthusiastic man who had been beaten promised his daughter he would fight to protect her, although she feared he couldn't. Seeing him as someone so clumsy he couldn't even cut an apple, Midian despised the soldiers for having escaped and abandoning the town they were supposed to protect. Asadin was surprised to see her showing empathy for the inhabitants, considering she's such a slacker, but in the end, he himself admitted to feeling the same way. That's why he declared it was time to part ways and, without another word, he vanished into the shadows. Meanwhile, at the town gates, a makeshift army watched the arrival of the goblins and the ogre who introduced himself as Goldu. He made his intentions clear. By showing off a barrel full of corpses, he planned to store all the fresh meat they could get from that large human village. The human captain decided to attack the leader first, ordering a volley of arrows. However, the ogre tanked them all. At that moment, a goblin wearing a skull mask seized the opportunity to advance on the gates, leading the attack. The captain tried to repel them, but the goblins were very organized and advanced quickly, supported by the ogre who threw enormous rocks capable of almost shattering the gates. The villagers tried to contain the goblins' onslaught outside, while the desperate captain ordered another volley. Among the archers was the little girl's father, resigned to his fate, hoping his daughter would manage to escape far away. Then, the skull-headed goblin appeared, thrilled that his staff began to glow brightly, which he interpreted as a sign that the Book of the Divine King was nearby. And he wasn't wrong, because just at that instant, its wielder dropped on him with a brutal kick that crushed him, before launching himself into the air and landing on the ogre who was preparing to throw another rock. The projectile was aimed at the archers, including the girl's father, but both were saved by Asadin. He immediately took them to the captain. There, he told him he would help defend the gate, though the man grew even more suspicious when he heard he was a herald. However, he couldn't complain, since our MC had already jumped back into the battle, firing 2 powerful arrows straight into the ogre's eyes. The ogre, filled with pain and rage, went berserk, frantically smashing everything around it, including its own allies. It didn't even notice Asadin using its head as a stepping stone to take out even more goblins. However, he was distracted when he heard the one-eyed bandit, writhing in pain, fall out of the ogre's barrel and barely managed to crawl away. Then, he ran into the skull-headed goblin, who was ecstatic by the book's presence and unleashed an overwhelming power, transforming its arm into a deformed mass of repulsive, gaping mouths that slowly began to consume it. Asadin noticed right away and thought this was going to be a massive headache. He watched as the deformed mass began to expand, spreading out like toothed tentacles, which shot straight towards our MC, who managed to escape. The ogre, however, was trapped, tortured, and torn to shreds by the fleshy amalgam that devoured it, along with many other goblins, making the abomination even larger. All this happened before the terrified eyes of the villagers, as our MC recognized as Kurt Godkin, the Fang King, a title way too cool for something as grotesque as that pile of meat. The goblin emerged from it, howling at the moon, before raising its staff, which flashed with a light that guided it to its target, the page from the book, which was right on the herald's chest, demanding he hand over the page in exchange for a painless death for everyone. The response was an arrow straight to the face, which enraged it even more, and so the attack began. Asadin fell back, but the tentacles advanced, assimilating every goblin in their path and stretching longer and longer as they pursued him. They managed to block his path, forcing him to cut his way through with his spear and slice the tentacles apart. He continued the battle against the toothed abomination. However, he soon noticed that the largest fangs were falling off with ease. This bruised the ego of the self-proclaimed Fang King. Asadin finally understood. It was just a cheap knockoff. With newfound confidence, he started to advance, watching the fangs fall off without him even touching them. But then his weapon began to corrode from the monster's blood, leaving him defenseless before the abomination's enormous jaws, which were about to devour him. This left Asadin complaining about doing all this work for free as he watched the monster close in, until several arrows suddenly hit it and pushed it back, courtesy of the captain and his men, who were looking for a way to help the herald, even though the soldiers were afraid that if the king's church found out, they would be punished. The furious captain reminded them that the knights had already abandoned them. However, their fear of punishment was still too strong, that is, until the girl's father, refusing to die there, decided to keep attacking the monster, even if it meant they'd have to fight the herald later. He created the perfect excuse for everyone to join the attack. The arrows began to drive the abomination back. Asadin smiled at the assistants, though he would have preferred they just shot the arrows at him so he could use them himself. But he had to work with what he had, the creature's loose fangs, grabbing one to throw it and deal a ton of damage. Pumped up, he started peppering it with every fang he could find. The monster got furious while Asadin ironically thought he was just being nice by giving its teeth back. This just made the goblin even angrier, now determined to become the Fang King and gain even more power. However, Asadin's response was a fang straight to its head. He reminded it that as a herald, his duty was to eliminate kings. Then he threw one last fang that decapitated the creature, ending it all. Or not, because just then the captain called him a soulless pagan and asked why he had saved them, all while holding back the archers who were starting to blame Asadin for luring the monsters, trying to make him take the fall. Asadin, resenting every insult they hurled at him, opted for the simplest solution, to wash his hands of any responsibility by telling them he had no idea how he got there, as he was just fulfilling a golden coin's wish. With that, he managed to deflect the suspicion onto them and their families. Nobody understood how, even in such a desperate situation, someone could have wished for something like that. Some even began to whisper, wondering who it was, but Asadin had no intention of revealing it and just left them to stew in their frustration. He asked for permission to leave, unless they would rather face him in the name of the king's church. He also casually reminds them that their noble had robbed them blind before fleeing and leaving them abandoned. However, even with all of this, with all those inconvenient truths, one of the men loses it and aims at him, furious that he dared to insult their faith. Though the whole scene just seemed amusing to our MC, who then noticed the bandit who had survived appear behind him, recognizing the boy and getting spooked. However, he just asked him to be nice, since life had literally given him a second chance, causing the grateful bandit to break down in a flood of tears. Meanwhile, with a quick move, Asadin got in front of the man who was aiming at him, as the captain stopped the archer, letting our MC move around freely, taking just a few arrows for the road. Before leaving, the captain thanked him. With that, Asadin took off at top speed, impressed by the huge risk the gate leader had taken by saying those words, and continued on his way quickly, while the owl complained that he lied to the people. The MC admitted that it was better than having them fight out of fear. The bird thinks he should look down on them, but Asadin, remembering how kind they had actually been, feels he can overlook their weakness. What he really can't ignore, however, is doing all the hard work and getting nothing in return. Finally, he meets up with the kids, who greet him happily, amazed by his feat against Kurt Isma. However, He gets sad thinking that he fought so hard and got absolutely no reward. Asadin ironically blames it on Midian and his whole idea that helping people is beautiful, and for him, life is no fun if it's not colorful. So he takes the opportunity to make fun of boring old Isma. Meanwhile, Asadin was surprised that the kids managed to get away from the caravan so easily. They said it was a piece of cake and were even gifted a torch. Adrian thought it was thanks to her beauty, but the MC was sure it was because she's just an adorable little kid, which made her furious. However, he was more interested in her knowledge, showing her Kurt's staff. Midian couldn't check it because she was too tired, but she saw an opportunity to become the MC's assistant. He had no intention of accepting that kind of relationship, though he agreed to be her friend and ended up owing her a favor. However, he had to hurry off to another place. So, Asadin returned to the caravan, where he was quickly spotted by the woman from before. She was worried about him and the children. The MC apologized for getting lost, though he knew his nephews would catch up soon. And while he was there, he told her that he'd heard cries of victory from the village, guessing that they had won, and would be returning soon. An old man confirmed the news when he saw a huge lantern beacon calling them back to the village, celebrating the victory. Asadin suggested sending a small group to go check it out. Just as the woman was about to thank him, he had already vanished, once again traveling at top speed. He complained he was so tired he could sleep for a week. However, there was no rest for the weary, as he spotted some strange smoke in the distance. It was coming from a camp where some knights were gathered around a fire. They were complaining that Lord Grey's priority was finding some book instead of protecting his people from ogres and droughts, basically writing the place off as a lost cause, though for one of them, none of that mattered. The only thing he cared about was that his commissions kept piling up, a fact that no one seemed to notice. What they don't know is that the camp is being watched by Asadin, who's looking for the bastard that escaped the village, but he needs a motive. Luckily, he remembers he's broke, and the Emperor's voice urges him to go after the big shot. In the end, Asadin agrees, since with all his travel expenses, he can't afford to pass this up. And so, Atarki started his morning by chewing out all his troops, because apparently all the loot had been stolen. He yelled that he paid them way too much for such shoddy service, but they just made excuses, saying it must have been the work of a real pro. The bastard blamed the squad leader, some guy with a scar who was just checking his own merchandise and would agree to anything his boss said. Seeing his complete lack of interest, Tarki decided to make the two guards in charge of protecting the loot pay for the losses, an idea the squad leader was totally fine with. However, it looked like he had lost something too, not that Tarki cared in the slightest. Then, the Scarface guy walked up, requesting they start recruiting in the nearest town. For the noble, that was a bit of a problem, since another noble controlled that area. And besides, he hated anyone daring to give him orders. Scarface's response was simple: pillage the town in his name. After saying that, he stabbed him with a huge grin on his face, leaving Tarki completely stunned, as were the rest of his men. Scarface gave him a threatening look, telling him to chill out, because the powder dagger was a gift from a witch, and a sinister energy started pouring out of it, transforming the hilt into a spider. This spider then crawled right into Tarki's body, who was absolutely terrified. Scarface figured he'd be fine, though when the noble tried to get aggressive, Scarface stopped him with a simple whistle that caused him excruciating pain. Apparently, the spider was just tickling his insides. The terrifying dude then warned him that if he didn't follow orders, the spider would soon start laying eggs, and he was looking forward to the show when they hatched, tearing him apart from the inside in pure agony. Darky begged him to tell him what he wanted. Scar, grabbing him by the shoulder, ordered him to raid the nearby town to capture the rat who had stolen from them. Meanwhile, the kids were sleeping peacefully until 10 in the morning, when their rowdy rooster alarm finally decided to wake them from their slumber, both completely drowsy. Especially Midian, who thought he was seeing double when looking at Asadin's staves, though the latter told him he had found the second one when he raided the noble's camp, which turned out to be exactly like the one he had taken from the goblin, the aberrant one, and he was hoping Yzma knew something about it. Yzma quickly took it to check if it was cursed, using his magic to analyze it. He made out a green and black essence inside it, which confused the protagonist, since the Fang King's essence was supposed to be red. He thought it might belong to another cult. Ismail confirmed it by determining that the staves were seeking specific targets, though he didn't know which ones, and besides, he felt they were very fragile objects, because they were created with hastily joined pieces, and even so, whoever made them had done an excellent job. Asadin understood what that meant. Someone was creating those artifacts, so he would have to keep dealing with trackers. He planned to keep an eye on the soldiers where he found it, and when he went back to spy on the camp, he found a very tense atmosphere compared to the day before, with everyone there preparing for a big battle, probably looking for the copy. The little ones asked him if he had seen anything, and as he climbed down from the tree, he told them they were getting ready to attack the next village, which, according to Yzma, being a public setting, was much larger than the other villages. Midian figured they must have a reason to do something so desperate, so they decided to head over there, marching toward the town where they were let in for free because of Asadin's blindness. He was surprised by so much kindness, though Ismail felt bad about not paying. However, they quickly forgot about it when they saw the carriage from the Corazon Peddlers Association running happily because they thought they could finally get some rest. The story flashes back to a memory from the past, where a blonde kid was pestering Ariel for being a traitor's daughter, even though he knew perfectly well that she was the strongest in the clan, something he quickly confirmed when he ended up with a broken ankle. But that day, the boy noticed not only Ariel's immense power, but also her beauty, thinking a lot about that moment, until a noise snapped him out of his thoughts. Flashing back a bit, we see the Protags group, crossing paths with the Corazon Peddlers Association, which started as a small guild that had grown quite a bit. But the most important thing was that it was secretly controlled by the Haragaza, which is why Asadin decided to lay low, while the kids just wanted to use the place to rest. Right at that moment, a trio of guys intercepted them, wanting to make fun of Asadin, whom they called out for being so mediocre yet already having servants just for playing Herald. He calmly corrected them, since the little ones weren't his servants, just some kids he ran into who were there to get their goat's hooves replaced. One of the merchants agreed quickly, unlike the arrow vendor, from whom he tried to buy a pair, only to end up being intimidated and treated like a fake herald for not passing the exams, convinced he got in thanks to a house recommendation, despite being a bedwetter incapable of learning the basics. Still, Asadin remained calm and simply paid. Midian and Isma didn't seem comfortable with the situation, feeling that a superior was being disrespected as they watched the men mock him. Even after receiving a lot of money, which Asadin also planned to use to buy some clothes, they mockingly offered their services by throwing a dress at him. This started to get on our MC's nerves, and he warned them that he didn't want to hurt them. That just infuriated the thugs even more as they continued to belittle him. That's when Midian cut in, suggesting that if they were going to keep running their mouths, they should challenge him to a duel. That is, if he wasn't afraid. Asadin thought she was the last person who should be talking about this, but the biggest of the thugs scoffed, claiming our MC couldn't take a single punch. Midian's response was to shoot up into the sky in a massive red bolt of lightning, landing on the big guy's back and threatening him with a knife, making it crystal clear they had just gotten way too familiar with a descendant of Ether, warning him that if they were going to disrespect a herald, they should back it up with actions. Otherwise, people might think they were shirking their duty to serve. The merchants watched the whole thing nervously, until the blonde dude from before appeared, trying to calm things down and greeting his old friend Asadin. While he was at it, he asked for the girl's name and then introduced himself as Derek of Sabin, apologizing on his companion's behalf, hoping Midian would calm down and not spill any blood. She agreed and backed off, although the thug's ego was still through the roof, despite being humiliated. So Rick sent them off to work, following the Herald's orders, and then invited our MC to have dinner later. After freshening up, Asadin was feeling calm again. Isma, on the other hand, was super uncomfortable and asked him why he always put up with the abuse in silence, thinking that if they had done that to his sister, he would have punished them severely. Asadin replied that he had no intention of being like her, which the boy found weird. Our MC admitted it, and for that very reason, he suggested Isma convince Midian to stay away before they were seen as weirdos too. With that, he headed off to dinner. Once he got there, Asadin realized the invitation was nothing but a farce, since Rick only wanted information about his sister. But he had nothing to say, nor any interest in her life, he just wanted to eat an apple. The blonde, seeing him as a troublemaker, didn't offer him a thing. Instead, he demanded a work report. Asadin calmly replied that he was doing what any herald was supposed to do, completing missions and collecting coins. However, Rick brought up business, like attacking his organization's rivals. Our MC wanted nothing to do with that deal, so he decided to ask if Rick knew anything about the staff he had found. Rick was already in the know. He knew what it was for and that it had belonged to the Kurdos, making Asadin the last to hear about it. He considered it a good contribution, but said he would have preferred a page from a book. With all the confidence in the world, our MC grabbed an apple and let him know that he had one, certain he was the only one to have found it, as he tried to enjoy his fruit victoriously, but he was interrupted by a very excited Rick, who begged him for it. However, our MC's response unleashed his furious screams that were heard even outside the tent where the little ones were, as Rick couldn't believe that Asadin distrusted them to guard the page, though the protagonist made it clear to him that, if he gave it to them, he would have to deal with that bastard Castle who had a group of mercenaries under his command, which included the heretics of court. Rick assured him he could handle it, because even though Ariel had defeated him in the past, he was still a former general, but for Asadin, their fighting would only mean trouble for his cover as a merchant, though the blonde guy insisted that the only thing that mattered was protecting the page. Besides, he didn't hesitate to remind him that they didn't trust a weakling like him to look after it. Asadin, however, knew that assessment was based on when they were kids. At that time, he admitted his sister was leagues above him, but now he felt he had grown stronger. Nevertheless, He also recognized that his sister was still the strongest being of their race with countless followers at her feet, so he doubted that even with all his training, he was anywhere close to reaching her level. Even so, he wouldn't give the page to anyone until he met with his boss. Rick, annoyed, reminded him that he was his superior, though at that moment they were interrupted by a guard who warned them about a problem at the east gate, where a group of guardians was protecting the entrance when they saw Tarki's troops marching firmly, who stopped them because there were too many of them to pass so late. Tarki tried to handle the situation with diplomacy, hoping the gate commander would ignore the rules for a bribe. At first, the leader played hard to get, though in reality, it seems he was just haggling, but Scarface didn't give him even a second more. He lands a blow right in his eye, taking him out on the spot. Tarki's terror grew as he saw how the other mercenaries were tearing the guards apart. Nervously, he tried to clarify that he hadn't ordered anything, but Scarface made it clear that without blood there was no fun. The noble scolded him, saying he was only complicating things. However, the sadistic mercenary had something prepared. He pulled out a medallion which he pulverized, scattering the dust into the air that washed over all his soldiers. Soon, they began to feel as if spiders were crawling into their bodies, filling them with pain and deforming them in horrible ways, until their appearance changed completely, becoming imbued with a sinister power. It was then that Tarki finally understood that he was facing a cursed heretic, who then mocked him for how long it took him to realize it, and proposed they work together to find the page. But with a simple puff of air, he activated the spiders that twisted his guts, making it clear he had no choice with the empty gazes of his new servants. The Kurd ordered them that no one was to leave the town while they searched for the thieving rat. The next day, a group of travelers tried to leave the town but were stopped by the infected mercenaries. The tired travelers tried to force their way through by force, but one of them ended up being brutally grabbed by the head, leaving the others terrified. But the main problem was that the strange mercenaries were beginning to experience an uncontrollable sensation, a ravenous hunger that deformed them even more, opening a disgusting spider-like mouth. Although the only thing they managed to devour was an arrow shot from the sky, which left everyone confused. Without anyone noticing, the MC appeared from the sky, descending to brutally stab it, and saw that from its blood began to emerge those tiny spiders that the MC instantly recognized as the servants of the Spider Queen Artra. All the villagers were fleeing in a panic from the monsters, while the kids arrived worried about the protagonist, who tells them this is just the beginning and that they need food and water if they want to hold out. Isma thinks this is no time to eat, but after what happened in the desert, Asadin knows he needs it. He forgets all about the fight, which allows a monster to sneak up behind him. Miriam notices and desperately screams to warn him. Asadin reacted just in time, dodging the increasingly abominable creatures that kept moving even with broken bodies, like puppets with spiders inside. The horror was shaking him, but it didn't stop him. And while dodging their attacks, he thought about trying a shockwave, throwing his cape to distract the monster long enough to charge all his strength into his fist, unleashing a brutal impact. A few spiders detach from it, but things get even more complicated when the creature looks even more grotesque and, returning to the attack, gets up despite the huge hole in its abdomen, looking more sinister than before. Just like its companion, it also starts to mutate. Luckily, from behind, someone hands him a torch, which he uses to repel the spiders, distracting it long enough for the kids to draw a circle of fire around it, making it start to sweat, although they had to control it so it wouldn't spread. At least they found the perfect method to eliminate them, with all the villagers joining in with torches and starting to incinerate the monsters. That's how they managed to eliminate them, with the MC delivering the finishing blow to the last one. With everything over, he asked the kids if they had gathered the provisions. Midian confirmed they had, while Isma asked if they should also look for the goats, being interrupted by the girl who was just seeking recognition for being useful in the fight, hoping they would accept them as followers. However, they too were interrupted by the Emperor's voice, who seemed to have found a new contractor. This one was very close, though he had just died at that very moment. Asadin regretted it, deciding to take the kids toward the battle at the gate. They both understood that technically, they were hired. Still, Asadin couldn't advance much, as he immediately ran into humanoid spiders that were increasingly deformed and that he could barely fight. He thinks that if he were just a simple human, he would have given up by now. The bugs kept mutating into more and more disgusting things, blocking his path to the contractor. Suddenly, an arrow wrapped in lightning strikes the monster head-on and zaps it with an explosion of energy. Asadin is surprised to discover it came from Midian. Super excited, she smiles, seeing her theory was correct. One lightning bolt is enough to finish it off. The problem is her body can't handle that kind of magic, and she ends up collapsing, exhausted, with Isma rushing to help her. Asadin, looking serious, thanks her for the help but makes it clear that they should stop there. This annoyed Isma, seeing that his friend had risked so much, and he asked the MC why he kept going, charging forward so desperately for a contractor who was already dead, But for Asadin, a request was a request, and he didn't want to ignore it. Isma complained that it was impossible to keep advancing with just fire. The MC accepted it, and that's why he planned to go straight for the head. Meanwhile, at the East Gate, everything was engulfed in flames. One of the survivors was crawling, trying to escape from a monstrous spider. Meanwhile, Kurt excitedly watched the spectacle of him being devoured. Tarki, on the other hand, doubted that this was okay. Even if it was for a page of the book, he felt repulsed by what he was seeing. Kurt admitted that maybe he had gone too far, but claimed everything was still going according to plan. Tarki, furious, thought that logically, if the thief had witnessed all that, he would have been the first to escape. Kurt, however, wouldn't listen to reason. It was then that he noticed something under one of the bodies being devoured, a triangle drawn on the ground. He recognized it as the ritual to summon the demon of the golden coin and guessed that the herald they had summoned and the thief could be the same person. Although Tarki didn't think it was a good idea to face him, Kurt, seeing that the ritual was complete, knew it was only a matter of time before he appeared. Just then, a red flash shot past the noble's shoulder and went for Kurt's head, who stopped it easily, putting him on alert. A second later, another arrow pierced his head, and he understood that the first one had just been a decoy. Far from being annoyed, this thrilled him, releasing his true form to face Asadin, who was charging right at him. Thus began their battle in an even clash between the two, watched closely by Tarki. The noble remembered that the best thing to do was to stay out of the herald's way, since whoever won between those powerful monsters would end up causing him problems, so he did the best he could, curling up in a corner, missing his mommy. Meanwhile, the brutal fight continued. Asadin attacked Kurt thinking he must be the leader upon seeing he was able to maintain his sanity in that form, which made him suspect he might even be a high rank. Kurt was also surprised by the herald's strength, as disgusting protrusions and spider legs began to sprout from his body, making it clear that Asadin couldn't beat him, although the latter was brimming with confidence, appearing in a second in front of him, seeing him as just a little spider, which made Kurt nervous, who tried to push him away. Asadin, using his beauty of spring technique, vanished into thin air. Reaching him in a second, he showed Kurt the spot where spiders can't reach their own backs, from where a slash precisely sent the creature's head flying, which landed right at the feet of the terrified Tarki, and now he knew he was next. He tried to convince the MC to let him live, but Asadin had no intention of listening to another speech about nobility. Tarki, being more cunning, showed him the golden coin, which left Asadin confused. The noble assured him it was a gift from his mother, who had told him that heralds were easily manipulated with that object. Asadin didn't care, since the noble hadn't even made a request. However, he tossed the coin into the triangle, which began to glow, and his request was to be saved from the spider venom. The emperor's voice accepted the deal, despite Asadin's complaints, who in the end had no other choice. Arki, crying with happiness, thanked his mommy for being alive, just as the kids arrived. They were not happy at all to hear that the noble had made a request, so Asadin asked Midian to use the thunder technique, though moderately. She agreed as friends, but not before complaining in 1,000 ways that they were not on the same team. After so many hints, the protagonist decided to accept her as part of his group. That made the girl very excited and made Isma extremely jealous, who saw how the young woman whose attention he so desperately sought was now very interested in someone much cooler. He felt defeated by this loss, though he just thinks his blood sugar dropped, while Midian, not caring about anything else, went ahead with the request, assuring him as she attacked that she would try not to kill him. That didn't convince the noble in the slightest, but he didn't have time to complain, as the cheerful girl had already zapped him with a huge electric shock. With that done, Asadin decided it was time to leave. However, Tarki, who was still alive and now healed, asked to go with them, knowing that if the king's church investigated the place, he would be dead, hoping they would take him somewhere he could lay low, thus honoring the goal of saving his life, something no one in the group seemed to like, especially because a while later, Darky continued to act like an idiot while trying to rent a house from some peasants, so the kids had to shut him up and drag him away, while Asadin negotiated, managing to get a barn for the night. Afterward, the noble complained about being dragged away like that, when, according to him, he was just humiliating the farmers whom he considered lazy for crying when it didn't rain, believing they were poor because they wanted to be. This gets on Asadin's nerves, who makes it clear to him that everything has a reason, including the fact that he now depends on them. The comment makes the noble blush with embarrassment in front of the others, hoping he learns to hold his tongue. As they tried to get settled in the barn, the noble continued with his diva attitude, refusing to sleep there, only to be ignored by Asadin, who was just arranging the hay at that moment. Midian approached him to ask why the name of the king's church was worshipped by some and feared by others. The protagonist explained that they were knights who protected the law of the 8 kings and that, in theory, they use white magic to protect people. The story is cut short by Tarki's unbearable snoring. Well, for Asadin, he's practically a living caricature of the church's problems, a bunch of noble bastards who do nothing but plunder. Midian looks with disgust at that noisy representation of the problem, although Asadin suggests it's better to imitate him and get some rest. At the same time, in the nearby forest where the group is spending the night, a squad of knights advances wearily under the command of Sir Gasrick, whose exhausted men ask him how much longer they have to go down this route without finding anything. Gasrick admits he also wants to finish soon, so he hurries them along. One of the soldiers jokes that since they haven't seen any demons, it would be better to go back and drink in the company of a few pretty women, even mentioning their leader's daughter, which made him uncomfortable, hoping they would drop the subject. However, most of them found it funny to think about his daughter's beauty, despite the age difference, which began to annoy him even more, causing the squad to ramp up their teasing until Gas sensed something that made him freeze. Crouching immediately, he ordered his soldiers to advance silently, moving through the bushes, until they found a gigantic wyvern that terrified them. The noise caused the monster to detect them, and in desperation, they began to shoot arrows, despite their leader's orders not to. They all flew towards the creature, which responded by soaring up and swerving at the last second, escaping through the skies. Gas felt uneasy when he noticed that, given its size, it was just a young one, which meant there had to be adults nearby. On top of that, one of the soldiers discovered where the monster had been playing, among the remains of a farm. A heartbreaking scene unfolded before the nervous captain. A man was dying in his partner's arms, a victim of a stray arrow. Then, Gas ordered his men to finish them off, claiming they had surely attracted the wyvern, although in reality, he just wanted to eliminate any witnesses to the accident. Meanwhile, the terrified woman watched as the soldiers approached like true demons to end her life. Back in the barn, the Emperor's voice woke up Asadin, who complained that he was never allowed to sleep in peace. The owl assured him that only those who are ready at his call are worthy of being his servants. Asadin, sarcastically, saw that as the reason why he had so few staff, but the desperate screams of a child interrupted him as he saw the boy run into the barn, immediately jumping towards him, trying to calm him down so he could say what happened. The little one, through his tears, confessed that his parents had been murdered by the soldiers on the outskirts. In an open field lay the bodies of all those who had been eliminated, brutally by the knights. However, the child was still missing, and unable to find him, Gas began to understand that the situation was getting complicated. He knew that the punishment for killing innocents was the gallows, and that he could only save himself by begging for Bishop Salazar's forgiveness, something very few could ever hope for. With his blood-stained sword, he knew that even if he could avoid it, in the end, he and his men would become mere bandits, dying in the streets. At his age, that was not a good option for him, especially for his son Milla, who suffered for being a bastard. Gas considered that he was doing it all for him. For this reason, he convinced himself to finish off everyone in the village. The soldiers thought only a few survivors remained, until a terrified woman ran in desperation, being spotted by a soldier who, as if in a merciless game, readied his spear and threw it with all his might. In the end, the old woman slipped, causing the spear to hit the ground. Annoyed at missing, the soldier grabbed her by the leg with a sadistic look. However, a huge piece of rock hit the back of his neck, making him fall almost unconscious next to the old woman. Amid his companion's confusion, Gas reacted in time to dodge Asadin's arrows, who was complaining that due to fatigue, he couldn't give his 100%. The soldiers attacked immediately, but the protagonist skillfully dodged, although he didn't enjoy using long-range weapons. He understood that he had to take their spears, so he prepared himself with a few small stones. Throwing them like powerful projectiles, the overconfident knight dodged them with ease, but he didn't expect that Asadin would change his technique and their trajectory, causing the cigars to hit him in the head, allowing the MC to kick him away and take his spear. The other knight, terrified, tried to attack, but Gas stopped him to talk with Asadin, asking him if he seriously wanted to have problems with the Holy Knights. The MC found the holy part ironic, seeing as they were indiscriminately eliminating innocent people. Gas claimed they were heretics, but when they asked for proof, especially about the couple who had gone out to work their land that morning, the knight had none. Using his position as an excuse and also accusing Asadin of being a heretic, then he unsheathed his sword, which began to radiate an intense glow that enveloped the entire place. Asadin ran to protect the old woman's eyes, remembering the technique Castle's son had used, as a huge beam of light enveloped the forest, leaving the MC even more blinded by the glare. Gas took the opportunity to launch an attack, but before he reached him, he had to stop upon feeling something. 2 arrows were heading straight for him, courtesy of the Herald's assistance, and the children ran towards Asadin, with Midian worried about the MC's eyes, although Isma still couldn't understand how someone who doesn't even have eyes could be blinded. Anyway, the important thing is that they managed to defeat 2 guards on their way there, and the girl expected to be congratulated for it. When Gas heard that a couple of kids defeated trained soldiers, he concluded that they must belong to the Herald Clan, heretics of the Emperor. He was convinced that he had actually wiped out a village of occultists. Asadin, in a mocking tone, pointed out that he acted without being sure of anything. Seeing the short hunting spear they were carrying, it became clear that the squad had only gone out hunting and accidentally hurt someone, so they decided to cover up their mistake by unleashing a massacre. Even though it pained Gas to hear the truth, Asadin offered him a way out. They could all become repentant knights and save their lives, but Gas instead saw the solution in taking down a high-ranking knight of the Heralds. He then began to unleash his light magic, forming a gigantic and imposing mace over his head, which Asadin didn't even pay attention to, happy that someone thought he was high-ranking. Gas decided to unleash his attack, letting the hammer of light fall. Asadin threw his spear with all his might, but it ended up being stopped and disintegrated by the hammer, which continued on its path toward the group, forcing them to run for their lives. The MC thought about how to counterattack, taking Midian's arrows, but first he had to dodge the annoying and incessant blows from Gas's hammer, which he recognized as pure brute force. Getting some distance, Asadin aimed at the sky, firing 2 arrows that soared as high as they could go. Neither Midian nor the knight understood the move, and the knight scoffed, deciding to attack him head-on, just about to cut him down, when Asadin vanished, confusing Gas, who failed to react as the MC appeared flying behind his back, grabbing one of the nose-diving arrows and, at point-blank range, fired a shot that pierced right through his head. To Midian's amazement, Asadin caught the second arrow he had launched, thanks to his arrow redirection technique. Afterwards, the protagonist placed the body of the knight's first victim next to his wife's. They were the parents of the little boy who ran to see the corpses, both ready to be buried along with the rest of the victims, who were being mourned heartbreakingly by their loved ones. Because of this, Asadin once again offered the knights the option to repent, in exchange for their lives. At first, they were reluctant, but they finally decided to accept, and the protagonist yielded. However, the rest of the villagers didn't accept it. They marched forward, furious and armed, filled with rage after seeing their families massacred, as if they were cattle. They rejected the herald's idea, convinced that the church had repaid their loyalty, which was strong even in the hardest of times, with betrayal. One of the knights, completely out of touch with reality, saw it as an uprising of inferior beings. The villager's response was a swift cut to his neck. His terrified companion watched as the others closed in, their eyes filled with furious desperation. A woman, caught between tears of sorrow and rage, held back, placed a scythe to his throat, convinced that letting him live would only bring them more trouble. The blood splattered before Asadin's eyes, who silently watched the family shattered by grief, understanding full well that from now on, if they were discovered, they would be exiled from their lands and left without the church's protection, condemned to wander as vagrants leading truly harsh lives. Sometime later, Asadin finished digging graves for the knights to prevent them from turning into the undead. Midian, however, understood that this was another humiliation, burying them against their faith. Even so, it seemed the group would continue on its way. Before leaving, Isma cautiously asked him if he really would have let them escape if they had become repentant knights. Asadin recalled an old riddle from the Heralds. If someone were to make a promise to a stone on the road, would it be a crime to break that promise? It was a metaphor used in a court ruling regarding promises made to the Herald tribes. Originally, any promise made under the light of royal glory had to be kept, but in the specific case of the Aragaza beings, considered to be soulless, it was enough for them to be classified as mere stones on the road, for the nobles to establish, upon a mountain of corpses and blood, that any illegal atrocity committed against them was permitted. That's why the knights' promise to become penitent held no value. Even so, Asadin trusted them to abide by their own laws. Isma, on the other hand, saw no point in it, because even if they did, they could never undo the pain of the victims' families. The protagonist knew this for a fact, but to him, the most important thing wasn't the pain, but survival. Now, although they had vented their anger, they had done so at the cost of living harsh lives as nomads. Midian watched him, seeing how he worried about the farm's members to the very end, who, despite their fury, had struggled to deliver the final blow to the knights. Asadin understood it was very different to execute a surrendered enemy than to do it in the heat of battle. Isma also looked at him with admiration for the confidence he projected. Meanwhile, the protagonist kept looking around for the spoiled noble, who seemed to. He had tried to escape when the chaos started. Midian commented that they would have at least saved some food, but tough luck for them, he was already back. So they continued on their way while Asadin complained that they never let him sleep, although the only one who seemed wide awake was Midian. Suddenly, the screams of the girl from the farm alerted them, blaming Asadin for her parents' death. A woman tried to calm her down, apologizing to the group of heralds. The MC wasn't upset, he just wondered where they were headed. They said they were heading west to find relatives to take shelter with while they figured out what to do. Asadin regretted that they were going in opposite directions. The villagers acknowledged that in the end, anyway, they would have had to move away, since the drought was getting worse, so it was time to part ways. But before they did, one of the villagers gave him a blessing in the name of the emperor to their savior, although the little guy believed, because of how he was raised, that it was more of a curse. Asadin continued on his way as the emperor's voice perched on his shoulder, complaining that his name was now being used as a curse when he had tried to bring civilization and wisdom to his people. The MC, however, thinks he had it coming, plus he had made the mistake of not choosing an heir. The owl accepted the criticism, yet he thought that even though it was only for one generation, he managed to bring some peace and a lot of suffering for the Aegean gods. Asadin agreed with him as they walked away from the villagers, who were optimistically determined to survive. Later, Taki was excited because the MC had managed to get rid of a church knight all by himself. Midian's opinion was that at least he was good at hiding, since she hadn't seen him at all during the whole fight. He tried to ignore that they were basically calling him a coward, but he couldn't overlook how Asadin scolded him for saying dangerous things out loud. He wished he could get him off his back, but considering the golden coin and the group he was leading, he decided it would be better to investigate what else was going on. At that moment, an old man appeared on the road who offered them some tea for their flag. He seemed to be from the Guild Society, a traveling merchant. However, once the tea arrived, he showed his true colors and he was a member of the Heralds who was hesitant because the noble was with the MC. The noble replied that he was just a simple coin user. Then, more seriously, he listened as the man asked him what he had done in those 3 months as a herald. Asadin said he was heading to Salazar and asked if there was any news. The merchant wanted to give him a side quest, take care of wyverns and bandits. The MC accepted, but only if he got some cookies in return made with sweet herbs. Once he received his cookies, he agreed to listen to the details of the mission. The merchant explained that for a while now, the church knights had been conducting rescue operations, for which they were requesting forced voluntary donations from the merchants. The MC didn't see a problem with the rich donating, as long as the money raised was used for the refugees. Midian, on the other hand, thought he was defending the church people way too much. The merchant got back to the point, mentioning that many merchants had chosen to take alternate routes to avoid the collection. However, those paths were infested with wyverns and bandits, although in reality, many of those bandits were nothing more than desperate folks with no other way to live, plus the knights were considering a new law that was turning all those roads into chaos, which is why he asked Asadin if he, according to his code, would take care of it. The MC, more interested in the fact that his cookies were running out, admitted that technically, that was helping. The merchant was amused to see him force himself to believe he was doing something noble. The ensuing taunts pissed off Midian, who ended up blowing up again, threatening to slit the merchant's throat if he didn't respect the heralds. Asadin stopped her, reminding her that even though she was a noble, she was still a child and should respect her elders. So, she either had to actually kill him or back off. Midian, embarrassed, retreated at full speed. The merchant, somewhat traumatized by the scene, accepted Asadin's apology for the altercation and the matter was settled. The MC decided he should start the mission. However, the merchant felt he was being mocked, believing they were playing good cop, bad cop to manipulate the situation. Later, Asadin thanked Midian for defending him, which made her happy, although he also asked her to stay away from those belonging to the Sabanga line, since it was rumored that they had demoted the herald before him, although she was just happy that he cared. Tarki, on the other hand, was surprised to hear that the Sabanga were part of the heralds, thinking that with that level of organization, they could help him. Asadin interrupted him with no intention of helping him reach the position of Margrave, as he knew Castle probably wouldn't choose a successor soon and that having his children's families receive luxuries and money to persuade him was just too convenient. Tarki, even so, felt he couldn't just stand by and do nothing, although the kids preferred that he did, since he was already being too much of a nuisance. He and his siblings at that moment found the inn they were looking for. Because of this, the MC was happy to see a familiar face, which sparked Midian's jealousy, who thought it was a woman and, well, it was indeed a female, but not of his species. It was an adorable and fluffy goat that Asadin petted tenderly. Apparently, he had rescued her from an arid area and had brought her there to be cared for. He had to leave her to take care of business at the inn. There, Tarki was shocked to see a pair of twins who seemed to recognize him. Asadin wanted to know who they were, and the noble explained they were his half-siblings on his father's side, with whom he had a complicated relationship. At first glance, they seemed friendly, greeting the MC and introducing themselves with names that were hard to take seriously. One was Kaka and the other was Chico, while Asari introduced himself as a simple pilgrim, grateful to Tarki for escorting him. The twins were surprised that their brother was being so kind and not traveling with mercenaries. The noble, nervous as he recalled his betrayal, could barely hold a conversation, so his siblings kindly offered to talk during dinner. After hearing the story, they expressed their sorrow for what happened to Tarki, who was still nervous and anxious to get to Salazar on the same destination as the pilgrims. Chico, for her part, warned him that there were checkpoints set up by the rescue knights up ahead. Kaka noted Midian's beauty, which stoked the girl's ego. However, he only mentioned it because he feared the knights would try to take her away. Asadin, hesitating, said he didn't believe the servants of the archangels would force anyone to go with them. His words left the siblings speechless, as they hadn't expected him to be so devout. Later that night, the inn filled up with men drinking without restraint. Amidst the laughter and shouting, some began to mock the blind pilgrim, who were apparently some crappy mercenaries and other merchants trying to avoid the roadblocks. They found it hilarious that a blind man had gotten a free ride and, on top of that, with such good protection. Tarky's brother felt uncomfortable because he knew that's how they talked, even though it was better for everyone to travel and cooperate, especially if they wanted to defend themselves from the monsters in the area. Seeing the pathetic scene, he was thankful the children were already asleep. The drunks tried to create a friendly atmosphere by passing him liquor, but Asadin refused on account of his pilgrimage. They took it as a joke, called him dramatic, and even doubted he could see through his bandages, making it the main topic of conversation with everyone wanting to know what was underneath. The blind man just asked to be left alone, already calculating in his head that if they kept bothering him, he'd have no choice but to act. Luckily, Tarky intervened, telling them to leave him be and get back to their drinking, warning that it wasn't a good idea to underestimate him. That only half worked, as the men changed the subject and started asking about the kids. The MC claimed they were a friend's children, but the drunks, noticing how pretty Midian was, suggested he should gift her to them with clearly perverted intentions. The insinuations started to irritate Asadin, though he composed himself and calmly replied that the girl's parents were nearby. Inwardly, he despised the disgusting intentions of those men. The drunks, disappointed, insisted the pilgrim have a drink, and he agreed just to avoid more trouble. However, at that moment, a fat drunkard mentioned that at the sawmill they'd be passing, there was a woman from the Herald Clan piquing the MC's interest. He listened intently as the man recounted how the girl's father belonged to the Herald Clan, but he hadn't been able to rescue her, and she had ended up in the hands of the sawmill's foreman, who raised her as a slave. They said she was very attractive, which fueled the lust of those present, although a few appealed to reason, remembering that slavery was against the church's teachings. Others knew very well that no one would care about someone from the Herald Clan, even talking about taking the daughters she might have given birth to, commenting that a bottle of wine was enough to pay the admission fee and satisfy their dark desires. The MC stood up from the table, flushed, drunk, and began to scold them for their perversions. The men tried to calm him down, saying they just wanted slaves to make some money, but Asadin, not measuring his own strength, sent one of them flying while continuing a sermon, reciting the teachings of the virtues of the Archangel Trinity, stating that the fewer people who sought virtue, the weaker the knights became, and yet, many still followed the path of perversion. His speech was so intense that everyone thought he was completely wasted, including the Kalsi, who decided to get him out of there, leaving the mood completely ruined. When they returned to the room, Tarky already knows that Asadin was only pretending to be drunk. The Herald admits it without a problem, saying it was the only way to get out of that situation, because nobody can stand fanatics. Miriam, for her part, can't help but make fun of his performance, which echoed throughout the entire inn. Isma, on the other hand, wasn't so calm. The topic of the slave girl has him on edge. Asadin calmly replies that he didn't receive any gold coins, so the best thing to do is to confirm if that woman is really part of Herald Miriam's plan. Miriam, a bit more serious, asks him if, upon finding out, he plans to finish off everyone who hurt her. Our MC just replies that he will if he has to. The next day, the caravan entered the monster-filled forest and getting organized while Asadin noticed there were more people than expected. However, the problem was something else, one that Midian also quickly perceived, a huge residue of dark magic that no one had noticed. Seeing everyone so carefree, Midian notices that Asadin is tense, and before she can ask, he orders her to protect the goat, as they are being stalked by wolves. She barely has time to react when growls begin to be heard from the forest, with the mercenaries preparing for the attack of the undead wolves charging ferociously, while the mercenaries try to get organized, forming a defensive line as best they can. However, the monsters suddenly stop, leaving everyone confused. Only Asadin understands what's happening, even though they're zombies and those animals still retain fragments of memory and their old hunting techniques. He knows the worst place to be is in the rear, right where a wolf grabs a mercenary's arm. Tarky, who's nearby, reacts immediately, managing to push the creature back to finish it off with a precise cut. This surprised Asadin and the kids, seeing that he wasn't useless, but rather someone capable of moving with agility despite the weight of his armor. Meanwhile, the brother with the ridiculous name ran to help him. Although Tarky claimed to be fine, he was still confused by the wolves' behavior, as they were only growling without attacking, though a human silhouette began to emerge from the forest. The merchant thought it was his friend Kareem, but the mercenary stopped him upon noticing the aura emanating from the newcomer, who soon revealed himself to be a rotten zombie. Finding themselves surrounded, the mercenaries decided to fire their arrows, but they flew in all directions, except towards the target, causing huge embarrassment among the kids. Faced with this scene, our MC had no choice but to intervene, using rocks to throw at the wolves, to the surprise of all the mercenaries, whom he tasked with taking care of the zombies while he faced the beasts. The battle against the undead began. Tarki's brother managed to defeat one, but a zombie appeared behind him and almost got him, only to be saved by the boy. Asadin observed that at least the mercenaries knew how to fight, although upon noticing the coordinated attack, he guessed that a mage was behind it all, so he knew this wouldn't be their last fight in this place. To make matters worse, the mercenaries started complaining, saying their contract was to fight wyverns and bandits, not zombies. The merchants claimed they didn't know they would show up either, and thanked them for exterminating them, asking them to continue the journey. However, the mercenaries refused out of fear of more surprises, deciding to leave them behind and head back. But then Asadin warned them that it would be harder than they thought, confusing the others, until they looked back and noticed in terror that the path they had come from had disappeared. Chaos erupts with everyone screaming in desperation. Only Asadin notices the dark mage has sealed the exit. He realizes the mage undoubtedly wants to kill them, remembering what the mercenaries said about the clan's slave. If it was true, maybe they deserve to die, but he's not sure yet, so for now he puts Tarki in charge of handling the situation, since he's the only one with a title who can mediate between the two groups and calm things down. The noble, with his ego inflated, promises to do so, but he ruins it with his arrogant tone, looking down his nose at everyone. He gives an empty speech, only managing to infuriate the mercenaries and merchants by treating them as if they were just worthless pawns, and even though he thinks it's an inspiring speech, in the end it just causes secondhand embarrassment for the heralds and fury in everyone else. In the end, everyone disperses, and Asadin watches him in silence, wondering how someone can fail so badly without even noticing it. Kaka also called him out on his terrible leadership. Tarki, confused, asked her why she wasn't joining the larger group, but Chico explained that trying to go back alone, it would be even more dangerous. They discovered that magic had distorted the path, so the girl used a powder that Asadin recognized as shamanic powder, which she scattered on the ground, causing a powerful and terrifying reaction of corrupted energy. The protagonist came to think that the mage might not even be alive anymore, but was a vengeful spirit haunting the forest. Kaka congratulated her on a job well done, patting her on the head, and even Asadin acknowledged how useful they were. Midian, for his part, assumed the Herald Clan slave had died and was now seeking revenge. However, Asadin considered that, if she really belonged to that lineage, she could have mastered that magic while still alive, hoping that if that were the case, they could reason with her. Isma, on the other hand, thought that was unlikely, so they press on until they reach a small village that seems peaceful at first glance. Chico thinks they must have already cleared out all the zombies, but just then, as a loud bang from inside a shed makes them jump in fright. She thinks it's another one of the undead, although a voice from inside breaks the silence, asking to be freed. Chico takes a step back, convinced that it's a talking zombie, but Asadin calmly pushes her aside and goes to investigate. He removes the bar from the door, causing an armored woman to immediately shoot out and fall flat on her face, but she gets up just as quickly and starts running without a word. Chico yells at her that it's dangerous, but the woman just says she's going to a place where no one can follow her. Everyone is just left bewildered as they watch. They figure she just had to use the bathroom, and once nature's call was answered, she returned to thank them for saving her, much to the pitying looks of the group. She introduced herself as Maya, administrator of the Salasma parish. Asadin was stunned to see someone of such high rank in a place like this, not understanding how a warehouse could be so desperate to be emptied. The embarrassed woman explained she was there on a mission, a sacred one. While she was investigating the warehouse, chaos erupted in the village and the panicked villagers ended up locking her in. Unarmed and afraid to use magic because of the undead roaming outside, she had been trapped. Although she didn't see any now, she told Sadie that the group they had entered with had repelled them, although they retreated before reaching the town. Still nervous, she asked him if he had seen any other holy knights, telling him that the original mission was to exterminate wyverns, so she had promised to meet up with her father, who was also a holy knight, in charge of training new paladins, someone she spoke of with pride. You've probably connected the dots by now, if they were in that shifting forest. Huh, the girl's father could only be gas. He was surprised that after all this time, Maya hadn't realized what a disappointment her father was, and even more so, considering her family was breaking one of the church's strictest rules, the one about not having offspring. Still, he chose to tell her that. He hadn't found any knights, suggesting she go get her gear with the brothers group to try and find him. She thanked him for his kindness as our MC watched them leave, feeling how cruel fate could be. Then, his group inspected the warehouse but found nothing of importance, so they decided to use the place as a base while searching for the magic user. Midian doubted that someone with such a high power level was still alive. Assassin understood that people who died unjustly or without receiving proper rites ended up becoming vengeful spirits seeking chaos. In this case, they knew very well that the main suspect was the woman from the Herald Clan, who was used as a slave for years, probably murdered, and was now back seeking revenge. And so, the whole team got to work crafting handmade arrowheads. However, Isma was annoyed about it, especially since he couldn't use his bow. Asadin made it clear that if he wanted to fight without revealing his herald identity, that was the only option. Midian thought the arrowheads were too simple, but for him, it was enough that they served their purpose. Though what worried the girl most was knowing if, by any chance, the sorcerer was still alive, and if Asadin planned to reason with her. Asadin didn't fully understand why she was asking that, but Midian knew the answer. It's because, unlike her, he truly values life. The herald remained silent for a moment, thinking that the woman from the Herald Clan was probably already dead, and that if by some miracle she was still alive, her rage would be perfectly understandable after a lifetime of pain. Still, deep down, he knows some things can't be fixed. Some wounds simply break you forever. Even so, Midian told him that if he decided to try, she would respect his decision. This surprised Asadin, seeing how the young girl was beginning to understand the value of life. However, to Isma, this was all nonsense. He couldn't forgive an abomination like black magic, nor could he understand how anyone could respect that. Besides, he was growing more and more jealous of the interest his companion was showing in the trader's son. Asadin, on the other hand, wasn't looking for anyone's respect. He just wanted to do what he felt was right with such a badass attitude that it only managed to piss Isma off even more. Meanwhile, Maya finished moving the boxes with Dark, keeping watch nearby as the fog grew thicker and heavier. It was clear something was approaching, and to make matters worse, the girl still didn't fully trust the pilgrim. She was struck by his calmness, his strength, and the way he seemed to have everything under control, which only fueled her doubts about who he really was. Plus, she was not at all happy that he was taking the lead, especially since she was convinced she was the most qualified one for the job. Midian, teasingly, reminds the expert that before they arrived, she'd almost wet herself in the warehouse, and that if it weren't for them, she'd still be trapped in there. Maya is left speechless, blushing and annoyed, but the mood shifts abruptly as a heavy silence falls over the area. From the forest, dozens of red eyes watch them through the fog, and they begin to advance. Their merchants and mercenaries now turn into zombies, and above them, a massive wyvern cuts through the sky, announcing their doom. Without a hint of fear, the MC asks the monster if it was the slave of the clan Herald who had slaughtered the village. The creature confirmed it, claiming this was its revenge for all the years they had trampled over the little it had, simply because it carried the blood of the heralds. Asadin asked if it was still alive, to which the monster answered yes. However, the MC knew he had asked a pointless question, since all specters consider themselves alive. He switched tactics and asked where it had gotten such power. The creature refused to answer, saying it would only tell him if he became its servant. Down below, the twins noted that the pre-battle chat was dragging on for way too long. As the monster violently soared through the air, Asadin tried to calm it down, assuring it that he wasn't among those who had harmed it. It didn't seem to be working, so from a hole in the roof, Midian suggested he reveal their true identities, but the MC knew what that would imply for the siblings and Maya. Isma, however, saw a simple solution. Just get rid of them. This deeply angered Asadin, outraged at how little the boy valued their lives, but even Midian couldn't see another way out. So, the MC made his decision, firing a shot so powerful that everyone was left stunned by the projectile, which moved like a bolt of lightning, piercing 3 undead in a row. With this, Asadin made his plan clear. To prove who was the strongest by landing precise headshots on the zombies that continued to advance until they crashed into the barrier the others had prepared, where they were met with spears in hand as he continued his assault. The kids observe that the MC isn't even trying to hide that he's a herald anymore, although Midian can't help but be amazed that his mastery of the night bow far surpasses that of other heralds, despite having become one with no experience and, worse yet, after being deemed useless, failing to understand how Cassis trained him to such a level. Down below, the rest of the group is terrified as they watch the zombies breach the barrier, while a wyvern circles the sky with a deafening roar. Everyone continues to fight, taking down the undead, when suddenly, an arrow strikes with great force from the side and fells one of them. It's Midian's doing, hiding in the shadows. Isma, however, can't help but worry seeing her use the herald's bow, though she insists she just needs to keep Maya from seeing. You see, she fought with a certain shyness, unlike the boy who attacked decisively, and Kaka, who finished off zombies without hesitation. They were leaving a long line of casualties on that flank, which Asadin watched with pride, making it clear who was the strongest. But the wyvern scoffed, growling at the sky, thinking he believed he had won. It unleashed its full power, causing the forest energy to shift and making everyone nervous as they watched how, from the dense darkness, a huge zombie bear emerged. With the main monster no longer holding back, it unleashed its full strength, sending all its undead, wyverns, and giant bears. Even Dean tries to cover the others, but but his arrows can't harm them, so everyone is forced to fall back. He understands that it's a trap, facing one of the wyverns alone, having to return inside the warehouse, where the children watch in fear as one of the bears approaches, dangerously close to Tarki, leaving him no escape, and receiving a brutal attack that sends him flying through the air with a single swipe, destroying everything in its path. Injured and exhausted, Tarki is left at the mercy of the zombies. Maya sees him from afar, and though busy, decides to unleash her full power, forming the enormous hammer of divine punishment. In an instant, she brings it crashing down on the zombies surrounding Tarki, including him in the blast. He barely manages to cover himself before the blow hits, unleashing a monumental explosion that leaves a gigantic rectangular crater where the bodies lie. Among them, the unconscious Tarki. Asadin then realized that Maya was a complete idiot for using an attack that would obviously harm a teammate. However, he had no time to dwell on it, because the main wyvern was still very interested in him, threatening him with all the undead marching towards his position, enjoying the irony of seeing the citizens of Hubris punished by someone whom they had despised. Meanwhile, Tarki's siblings, injured and exhausted, barely managed to escape the wave of living dead that are also beginning to overwhelm the little ones. With an arrogant voice, the wyvern proclaims that everyone is falling before the true power of the Herald Clan, but Asadin only feels pity. He knows that this enemy will never understand what truly that power means, and with a simple movement, he shoots an arrow so precise and devastating that half of the wyvern's body vanishes instantly, causing the creature to nosedive straight to the ground. Then, Asadin calmly clarifies that this is the power of the heralds, the power of arrows that can shoot down stars from the sky. Continuing the attack, he fires arrows directly into the wings of the other monsters, which plummet violently. Asadin advanced, making it clear that by the Emperor's decree, the Aragaz were destined to strike down gods. That was the true name of his tribe. The main wyvern, on the verge of death, managed to ask for his name, and so it believed that man was a herald of the Emperor. The dragon trembles with contained fury until it lets out a loud laugh while agonizing, releasing a great dark aura that completely envelops it, which guides Asadin's gaze towards the forest, where a female figure advances slowly. Her skin is rotten and her eyes are empty. The woman speaks to him in a broken voice, claiming that she waited 10,000 nights for the clan to come for her, but no one ever came. Asadin understands just by looking at her that this woman hasn't accepted death, and he apologizes for not having been able to prevent the humiliation she suffered for possessing their clan's blood, but his words don't soothe her pain. They only stoke the fire inside the writhing woman, who unleashes her dark energy, cursing the fate that left her rotten, corrupted, broken inside and out, and filled with hatred. She swears she won't find peace until she sees every living being die. Her scream echoes, unleashing a horde of zombies that charge at the children, completely surrounding them. Asadin, trying to calm her down, asked about her children. She became even more enraged at the memory that they were the result of the outrages committed against her. However, our hero reminded her that the mere fact they carry her blood already made them targets for suffering equal to or worse than her own. With those words, he managed to get a little closer, asking that if she didn't want that fate for them, she should surrender and tell him everything she knew about their whereabouts, promising in the Emperor's name to rescue her children. She considered it impossible, but Asadin reminded her that their clan had always done the impossible, causing a spark of hope to return to her eyes. She then heard that, despite everything they had suffered, the clan had never lost its light. All of this was being watched closely by the duo of children who, knowing the protagonist, felt his speech was a bit hypocritical, knowing that in reality the clan never had any true conviction. It was quite the opposite. They lived under an imposed curse, which led to the clan's pride and honor being replaced by greed. The founding clan's own plans were still the same. Upon finding the copy of the king's book, they could get rid of the curse, and then they would be free to use their great power to repay the continent for all the pain and humiliation it caused them. Midian saw it as a horrible pyramid scheme in which only the strongest could stand out, understanding that the idea of a conviction was little more than a lie. However, they didn't understand why, even knowing all that. Asadin's words managed to reach her heart, and she wasn't the only one convinced, as the woman also ended up surrendering. She remembered how in her dark, lonely, and cold confinement next to her newborn, she cried as she struggled to crawl over and hold him. The baby instinctively grabbed her finger, and in that moment, she felt an enormous warmth that lit up her life. She cried as she was finally able to hug him, feeling that they only had each other. That's why now, on her knees, her face returning to normal, she begged Asadin to save all the children she was never able to embrace. Just then, his assistants noticed the magic leaving the zombies' bodies, much to their amazement, while nature began to flourish once again. Midian couldn't contain her joy at seeing that it was truly possible to save people with conviction. Meanwhile, Asadin assured her he would keep his promise, hoping to get some information. The woman told him she had stored what she could about the children in the warehouse and that the dark magic She got it from a grimoire that whispered to her, especially the Book of the Divine King. But before she could say more, a fire spell spread like veins across the field, incinerating the woman who screamed in pain before falling lifeless into the protagonist's arms. That's when a group of heralds appeared, led by a fire mage who mocked him, saying that due to his zero talent for magic, he hadn't even noticed the woman didn't belong to his clan. He introduced himself as spirit number 106 of the Heretic Clan, Calypso, capable of incinerating everything in his path with his grandiose mission of exorcising evil spirits and searching for the pages of the book. Asadin was just annoyed because they interfered with his mission, but the smug spirit made it clear that he had heard the rumors about his incompetence, being unable to even control his assistants. With those words, the protagonist recognized who was backing Calypso, the same ones Midian had. Intimidated in the village and in the desert, traffickers and merchants, they had contacted Calypso to get their revenge. Asadin, looking bored, raised his bow, noting that he had managed to drain all the black magic from the woman's body, though he regretted not being able to talk with her more. Calypso insisted that the woman was a nobody, so there was no reason for him to intervene, expecting Asadin to thank him for saving him more trouble as he used his staff to extract the page of the book from inside the corpse. However, before he could take it, it moved as if guided by a current of air until it reached Asadin's hands, who calmly took it, much to Calypso's fury. In that instant, a powerful, low-flying arrow shot past them and crashed into a tree, courtesy of Midian. That only managed to irritate the herald even more, and to fire, but Midian scoffed, claiming that the pages had simply sought out the strongest one present, while also scolding Calypso for being such a show-off that he didn't notice he was burning a forest that was barely surviving the drought. But the Fire Herald had no interest in being lectured by a mere servant, regardless of her lineage, which irritated her greatly, especially when she noticed that the cowards she had threatened before were now siding with him. Then, Asadin intervenes, reminding him that although he has a higher rank, he's actually 1 year younger, treating him like a mere junior. Calypso responds with a childish attitude, appealing to his rank, while Asadin, just as childishly, retorts that he should respect his elders. Still, what really matters to him isn't the argument, but getting information about the woman. Calypso states that she doesn't have Zaragaza blood, but Asadin doesn't care. He knows that they condemned her to martyrdom based on that assumption alone, and if they didn't do something to right that wrong, the clan's honor would be stained. Midian listened to him astonished, and though she couldn't find the words to express it, she recognized that Asadin wasn't haughty or arrogant, but completely sincere. She saw how regardless of whether someone belonged to the Empire or the Zaragaza, he upheld his honor and pride before anyone. She felt that in a situation like this, upholding one's ideals was actually beautiful. However, for the other clan members who were there, that was just a reason to mock him for talking about honor. Because of this, Calypso challenged him to a duel, putting his rank and the information Asadin wanted on the line against the pages of the book in Midian. Our protagonist didn't understand why she was included, but the herald, still annoyed by the way he was being spoken to, promised to teach him some respect. Midian trembled helplessly at their words until our protagonist reassured her, telling her there was no need to accept that bet, since the pages had chosen him, and if he found the woman's diary, he wouldn't need any more information. Completely shutting the others down, they started to worry when they realized they might not get the pages. So Calypso, not wanting to look like a fool, added to the bet that if he lost, he would personally find the woman's children and take them to his clan's sanctuary. That caught Asadin's attention, who accepted on the condition that he also promise to be their stepfather, which Calypso agreed to just to get things started. He asked if it would be a formal duel, but to Asadin, taking 100 steps already sounded exhausting, so he decided to start right away. Before Calypso could even move, a blast of energy shot like a whirlwind straight for his head, hitting so hard it knocked him unconscious, leaving his followers speechless, with no idea what had just happened. Asadin, without even breaking a sweat, called the duel over, expecting the herald to keep his promise. After this, Asadin sent the children to tend to the wounded, while he asked the other herald's assistants if they would keep their promise. Still confused about how he'd done it, they accused him of cheating. He made it clear it was a surprise attack as part of the duel, but if they insisted, he could finish him off. That was enough to make them all feel threatened and swear to uphold the promise, with a very unconscious Calypso still on the ground. Sometime later, our protagonist made his way through the Fallen until he reached his protege Tarqui, who, according to him, was still intact despite everything, ordering the clan's servants to take him to the carriage. Midian arrived, surprised that he knew so much about medicine, but Asadin really didn't know anything. He just explained that the closer he got to a person, he could even see their bones and internal organs. The children, however, didn't quite believe him. Even so, Asadin continued to show off his ability by knowing exactly where the next injured person was. It was the brothers who, because they wore light armor, had serious abdominal wounds from the bear attack, and the last injured person was Maya, who had no visible injuries, only extreme exhaustion from overusing her energy. Isma suggests they not keep her alive, but Asadin immediately refuses, not letting anyone die. And so, they load everyone into the carriage, while Midian hurries them along, telling them to be quick, looking visibly worried. Seeing all the chaos of the last few days and fearing it was a sign that something even worse was about to happen. But Asadin calmly tells her it's not a sign, since whatever is coming has already begun. Sometime later, Calypso finally woke up. Completely confused, he immediately found himself face to face with our protagonist, who seemed happy to see him conscious. Expecting him to fulfill his promise, Calypso handed him an umbilical cord along with a great deal of information about the woman's children and the buyers, expecting him to take care of the rest, while he handled everyone who wasn't from Salasma. Calypso, despite the terrible first impression, assures him that he will keep his honor and his word. Despite all this, and the fact that Asadin trusted him, the only thing he still didn't understand was why the Herald was suddenly speaking to him so formally. The Herald, embarrassed, admitted that he now considered him his superior. Even though he didn't understand how he'd managed to defeat him without using the magic of nature's beauty, the MC couldn't quite explain it yet, but he hoped he would understand in time. Still, he asked him where he got the wand from. Calypso confirmed that he had gotten it from a Kurt he had eliminated. With this last bit of info, the MC concluded that it was indeed a mass-produced item. And so, the Herald promised to finish his mission quickly before saying goodbye. This way, the MC felt relieved that everything was peaceful again, watching as the kids, the siblings, and everyone else rested peacefully. He decided to join them. Sometime later, the goats were eating peacefully while everyone was gathered there. Maya was surprised that he had managed to defeat the undead. The guys who had arrived with Calypso pretended to be part of a group of mercenaries who ended up fighting and exorcising the woman's corpse, thus managing to maintain all their alibis. Now, with everything calm, the siblings asked where they were going next, as they were planning to rest at the first inn they found. For her part, Maya decided to return to the forest to look for her father, leaving immediately despite the others' doubts. Grateful, she hoped their paths would cross again, saying goodbye to everyone. And while watching her leave, Midi noticed Asadin was a little restless. She thought it was because of the woman. However, he wasn't interested in the girl. He just found it strange that since that morning, he hadn't heard the annoying owl. While everyone was getting ready to part ways, Taki was still being annoying. This time, he was pestering a mercenary to give him a horse because of his noble blood, although the MC understood since that's how he was raised. Just then, the siblings came to talk to Asadin, knowing full well he was no ordinary pilgrim. The boy offered him a free fortune-telling, although Asadin tried to refuse, and Isma considered them scammers. Still, the girl activated her eyes and read that, in the future, he would be a great knight. To the MC, that made sense, though not in the way they thought. However, her words managed to cheer him up. As time went on, Asadin kept looking for the annoying owl, but Isma interrupted him to let him know they had a problem with another animal. The goat was dying of thirst. Taking advantage of this, Taki complained about taking this arid path, even though it was actually the best option. Finally, they managed to find a water source, but it was completely contaminated. Just then, a group of villagers appeared, running and desperate to collect the dead fish floating in the water, trying to salvage them for food regardless of the risk. Isma guessed that the river must have clean water further upstream at the source, but Asadin knew they had to first ask the villagers for permission. To their bad luck, Taki offered to do it and, as always, acted like a complete idiot. Midian sighed, hoping to be able to teach him some manners one day. Luckily, Asadin resorted to the old blind pilgrim trick and managed to calm the situation down, and in a matter of seconds, he won over the people's kindness. Isma complained about the Herald's way of doing things, though she didn't care about him, but rather how Midian was starting to admire his methods too much, which, while they always worked, she also felt that they shouldn't be so influenced by him. Later, they arrived at the village where the scrawny but happy villagers prepared a lobster feast. A kind man brought a large portion to the MC, who doubted it was right to accept so much. However, if he didn't eat it, it would just go to waste, so he preferred for everyone to enjoy it. Gratefully, Asadin returned to his companions to share the food. Midian hesitantly asked what they would do now. He replied that he would go look for the woman's son, and Isma wanted to know what they would do after that, since they couldn't just take a child, but the MC was already planning to hand him over to the Courtier Guild to be taken to Calypso, a task that was a real pain for Isma, with an attitude that angered her friend, but still, Asadin finally felt that this was his duty as a herald, hoping to hear the owl again soon. Meanwhile, Calypso had to put up with his subordinates, who had already found out what happened with Asadin. They all believed that if he kept his promise, he would just be wasting time searching for the book and that it would go against his goal of rising through the ranks of the heralds. Calypso knew they were right deep down, but he didn't have another choice either. Still, he ordered that no one mention anything about Asadin. He didn't even want rumors. His subordinates didn't understand why, but Calypso simply didn't want to be the only idiot to underestimate him. But then, a voice interrupted him, introducing itself as the true voice of Ariel. Calypso couldn't believe what he was hearing, as the Emperor's voice was an incredibly powerful spell, a spirit that spread across the entire continent and was responsible for connecting all the artificial spirits to transmit information. It was a magic so immense that only the Emperor could perform it. He found it incredible that Ariel could imitate even a fraction of that power, asking what he wanted from him. And then, the monstrous crow controlled by Ariel made him an offer he couldn't refuse. Meanwhile, the MC arrived at a village where, upon asking about the woman's daughter, all the villagers fled, making it clear they were hiding something. He didn't get much information until, for the first time, the arrogant and annoying attitude of the noble Tarki managed to scare the villagers enough for them to point out the Telverin clan's bakery. With that, he now had a target. As he walked to the place, the MC hoped that since the girl was still little, she hadn't been mistreated. However, that assumption crumbled when, from inside the bakery, a man emerged with a bloody whip and his clothes equally stained, as if he had just used it on the small figures that could be seen inside the shop. Thanks to his status, Tarki got the man to act friendly, allowing the MC to describe the features of the girl they were looking for, but the guy's attitude changed completely, though Tarki forced him to be calm again. Still, the answer that the girl had died didn't convince them, especially seeing the two little ones inside the place, whom the man pretended to treat as orphans he had taken in. Asadin, not at all convinced, asks him what the funeral was like. The man becomes hostile again, so Asadin gives Tarki a signal. He doesn't hesitate for a second, kicking him so hard it brings him to his knees. Then he threatens him, saying he has unfinished business with the girl's parents and that they need to know where the body is. The guy, trembling with fear, ends up confessing that they threw her in the river. Asadin freezes, unable to believe what he just heard. He now understands that this damn guild exploited its slaves to the very end, and then disposed of them like trash, tossing them into the riverbed. In a world where the dead can come back to life, this seemed insane to him, something as cruel as it was stupid. Isma saw this as a chance to mock the MC's morals, suggesting that the righteous thing to do would be to finish the man off. But if they did that, the slaves would be abandoned and they couldn't save them, even if they handed them over to the Courtezar Guild. The Telbaran Guild would consider it a betrayal. Asadin knew that the Courtezar Association, being one of the ones that supported the Heralds, wouldn't start a conflict between guilds. It was a problem that couldn't be solved with simple justice or compassion, and everyone was waiting to see his decision. The MC gave him a weird look, wondering if he'd always been this strange. Midian commented that Asadin wasn't like this before. Asadin admired his intelligence, admitting he was right. However, before he could give his analysis, Tarki stepped forward, starting to furiously kick the scumbag for betraying his boss's promise to save the children. Asadin was a little embarrassed to be called boss, but even so, the noble decided to take all the children to his mother, who always needed servants and offered a good working environment. Midian observed how useful that piece of trash had turned out to be. Asadin was bewildered, and the MC felt satisfied that everything had worked out in the end. Thanks to Tarki, they managed to get a written confession about the child trafficking, and with that, Asadin decided to use the Courtezar Guild to transport them to Tarki's mother's house. And so, during the night, the MC ran into a rather aggressive group that apparently recognized him, treating him with contempt and looking down on him, which confused Midian, seeing them so arrogant despite not even being heralds. However, pointing their swords at him, they made it clear that they were indeed his superiors, because Asadin had been dismissed from the heralds. Both of them hope Asadin won't put up a fight, since if they manage to take him in, they could become heralds. However, Asadin was convinced that these guys were just high on something. Still, he watches them get ready, unsheathing their swords with absurd confidence. He sighs, thinking they're way too desperate to be picking a fight in the middle of a village, so he decides to beat the story out of them. The two of them mock him, laughing as they remind him how they used to make him cry until he had no strength left. Asadin doesn't need them to tell him. He remembers perfectly how they would cover half his face to force a kiss on him, pretending he was a rel. Thinking about it filled him with deep disgust. The aggressors try to shut him up, but the silence surrounding him is thick with repulsion from everyone else. Asadin decides he's had enough, so he takes the opportunity to get his revenge on both weirdos, who attack at the same time, but their strongest blows are easily blocked, with just the palms of Asadin's hands being enough to stop them. They try to inject magic into their swords, which ends up melting them. He exhales in annoyance and acts, invoking natural beauty, channeling electricity. Using the swords as conductors, he unleashes a brutal shock that sends the weirdos flying. The two of them are left sprawled on the ground, trembling, not understanding how the hell he can use the electric palm without resorting to magic. Asadin just asked them not to die, or at least for one of them to survive. Shrouded in dark energy, he watched as they tried to counterattack, but he vanished into thin air and appeared behind them, sending them flying with such force that they ended up completely wrecked on the ground. Barely able to crawl, they looked at him in confusion, not understanding how he was able to use so many techniques. Even though he wasn't supposed to be able to use magic, the protagonist appeared before them apologizing for not holding back. But he congratulated them for still being alive and said he was waiting to hear the whole story. However, at that moment, the Emperor's voice echoed again, this time through a crow that informed him something serious had happened. The chief had decided to expel him from the clan, and to make matters worse, the service curse had been activated. The kids were in shock and Tarky didn't understand a thing, with everyone remembering that the service curse consisted of forced compliance whenever the elders decided to unleash it on someone. He had to create his own successor, just as his father had done, leaving the protagonist completely freaked out, listening as the crow revealed that in 1 year the curse would activate, forcing him to give birth to a successor before he died. Darky was the most surprised, not understanding how that was biologically possible. He wondered if in that case the baby would have another father, or a different mother, throwing out such absurd theories that they only managed to stress out Asadin even more, until the kids decided to shut him up. The protagonist wondered what kind of demon could have invented such a curse, but the crow clarified it wasn't his fault, but the first leader of Arconia's. Still, he couldn't reveal any more. Asadin asked him to tell him anyway, but the crow explained that the Emperor's voice was a spell that allowed an animal spirit to exist eternally as long as it didn't reveal certain information. The problem was that, even at that moment, by speaking with an exiled member, its own existence was beginning to corrode. Everyone was confused, seeing the spirit risk so much for the protagonist, while Taki, happy as can be, celebrated that his new boss was someone so important, but the protagonist couldn't care less about any of that. He was still frustrated by the sheer stupidity of that curse. The two defeated heralds asked him to show some respect for the spirit, but Asadin, completely rattled, just replied that he had worse things to worry about than a little respect. Taki, on the other hand, asked the kids if something like that was possible, and Miriam clarified that in theory, yes, since Asadin had been born that way. Just then, the protagonist flew into a rage, demanding to know why they had suddenly decided to expel a herald as hardworking and diligent as him, and even worse, to see him. That's when the weirdos revealed the truth. His twin sister, Ariel, had murdered the elder Kenahan, stealing all the pages of the Divine King's book in the process, thus committing an act of high treason. With this act, the kids understood why the curse was activated. Although for Asadin, the problem was that it had also been placed on him. The weirdos made excuses, saying that everyone thought they were working together, which the protagonist found ridiculous, seeing as she was basically the one who messed up his face like that. They maintained that the girl supported him, which finally made him snap, since he had always been suffering from the very bottom. Despite his sister's success, while he was just a lonely, crybaby kid, they were the ones who licked Ariel's boots, not understanding how they reached that conclusion, screaming it with obvious fury on his face. The weirdos feigned ignorance, but the protagonist, tired of it all, began to laugh sadistically, thinking that if that's the case, he should start exterminating every clan member he finds to show them what a real rebel is. They, terrified, upon realizing they would be his first targets, tried to suggest he go to the elders, remembering that, according to the story, only one person has died from that curse. However, he rudely reminds them that person was his father. Asadin, shortly after, with the carriage ready and the little ones secured, thinks he'll have no other choice but to go with the boss. The weirdos, all beaten up, think he made a wise decision, but they ask him for a favor and, since they're all going to appear before the boss, to say that they captured him. The MC, with a mocking smile, offers them something better, making them excellent at hitting high notes. Although they complain that's too cruel, Asadin remembers how much they made him suffer and thinks that castrating them would be even an act of kindness. And so, the frightened men apologize and admit they did it to prevent him from getting hurt, because there's a capture order out for him, wanted dead or alive. They doubted he could fight all the clan members he might run into, fearing he could die, but the MC isn't willing to risk being captured before reaching the commander of Salasma. Besides, he knows that other than Aldis and Cassis, no one could catch him. With everything ready, he sent the weirdos with the children to escort them, who left respecting the MC, seeing him as the pride of the clan, and stating that they would tell everyone how the Emperor's voice had defended him, knowing that this made him someone important. And so, sometime later, the group arrived in Salasma, a huge city with 3,000 houses and farms that had prospered thanks to its abundant copper mines, where Tark, who cleared a path through the crowd of villagers thanks to his status, although still annoying, was at least also useful, hoping his little boss would praise him for it. But the MC was more focused on the stares from some guys from Cortazar, who clearly knew about the capture order. Tarky solved the problem by calling them out as threats to a nobleman, so they had no choice but to apologize, but he wasn't satisfied with a simple apology and demanded compensation. So the men had no choice but to hand over some silver. Asadin was surprised at how useful the nobleman's masterful performance was turning out to be, until an enthusiastic Tarki asked for permission to keep doing the same thing to others, seeing he could make a good profit with the children, and realizing that in the end it was just looting, and the MC was disappointed. Just then, a white-haired woman appears and greets Tarki. She seems to be his half-sister, Bune, who, to her brother's surprise, tells him she's doing something similar to him, using her status to get some benefits, and asks him why he isn't with his mercenaries. Tarki remembers that things happened, and she, surprised, tells him what happened with Kosel, how he was beaten up and his little things were cut off. Tarki, amused, celebrates, thinking that God rewards the righteous in the end. Focused on his mocking, he gets too confident, and his sister, noticing he's alone, draws her sword, about to finish him off. Luckily, before she can, a rock hits her hand. Furious, she discovers it was the MC who immediately recognized her intentions as soon as he saw her approach. Tarki was in disbelief, while Bune said that instead of getting the page from the book, she'd rather eliminate the competition, which was the signal for her men to start attacking. Tarki defended himself as best he could, trusting that his little boss would finish them all off quickly. However, the MC didn't move, wanting to observe his skills, letting him struggle for a bit, while Midas imagined what he'd look like once Asadin's pregnancy started to show. All the bullying starts to stress him out, which according to Midian is bad for the baby, managing to irritate him even more. But the most annoyed one is Boone's warrior, who's still waiting to attack, since no one is paying him any attention, so in the end he decides to go for it, only for the MC to easily dodge them thanks to his skill, deciding to leave the fight to the kids, to test just how good they are. However, they complain that they can't go for the kill, which makes the whole thing much more boring. And so, Asadin just watches the battle, confused to see how Tarki is fighting while riding his horse backward. Meanwhile, Isma is facing off against a mercenary who feels underestimated, even though his first attack is easily dodged, and he gets a counter right to a vital spot, with the MC admiring how Isma managed to strike a non-lethal but dangerous spot, recognizing that from the way he moves, he's way too good to be a herald. Meanwhile, Tarki ended up taking a hard fall from his horse, disappointing the MC, seeing so much expensive gear wasted on someone so useless, and now seeing him helpless on the ground. He decides it's time to intervene. Before long, Asadin had Bune and his men on their knees, all of them beaten up. She complained that even after handing over the loot and money, he still went and clipped Asadin's nails. In a very bad mood, he suggested that if she kept complaining, the torture would continue, so she decided to leave him alone. Before letting them go, Asadin warned them he was only sparing them because they hadn't actually killed anyone, but if they ever committed crimes again, he'd hunt them down himself, causing them all to flee. Tarki expressed his disgust at how they tried to take him out just for an inheritance, especially when he thought they got along with his sister. Asadin, for the first time ever, actually backed him up. Meanwhile, Midian, feigning tenderness and understanding, told him she understood his mood swings were because of the pregnancy, trying to console him, which only managed to irritate Asadin, who knew perfectly well that the curse didn't work that way. Isma, on the other hand, mentioned he returned the candelabra from Bune's loot, not understanding why the MC was going through so much trouble. He explained that he preferred to do things the right way, even if he couldn't always manage it, adapting with flexibility to each situation. That, however, seemed to displease the kid, who admitted that he found the MC's way of thinking totally alien, saying he'd rather deal with looters or assassins. Even so, Asadin understood his point of view, just as he understood Isma himself. Just then, Tarki interrupts them and shushes them, because the rescue knights were approaching, though for Asadin this was exciting. He stared at their flag like an excited kid, which confused his companions, who knew what those knights were supposed to represent in theory, but also knew they didn't have a very good reputation. Midian thought about bursting his bubble, but she sees how happy he is and decides to keep her mouth shut. This worries Isma, seeing her act so considerate, but she pretends she's only doing it so the baby won't get stressed, although the MC replies that the only one stressing him out is her, because he now feels that with the pages and coins he's acquired, he has enough to negotiate lifting the curse, doubting that with all that, anyone would still want to take him out because of what Ariel did. Later on, everyone is setting up camp and Tarki complains about having to do work, while Midian wonders where the MC is, who seems to have followed the rescuers. Meanwhile, Midian is carrying the borrowed blankets, which, if not returned, will get them cursed to go to hell and be reincarnated as Heraldos, a threat that ironically works more as motivation for Isma. At that moment, Asadin returned. He had gone to get bread with the rescuers, coming back very excited to meet them, to the point that he paid them according to the law, although he couldn't get their autograph. Midian wanted to shatter his illusion, reminding him that no matter how heroic they were in the books, if they were discovered, they would try to eliminate them, but he didn't really care. However, things changed when he took the first bite of the bread, finding it inedible. And so, they ended up using it for the stew, hoping it would soften, although Midian didn't think that stuff was fit for human consumption. The MC, however, couldn't just throw it away, right when some scrawny little kids showed up begging them for food. When he asked why they didn't go to the rescuers, he found out they only gave food to adults. The children, on the other hand, were recruited. Asadin agreed to let them eat and leave, which annoyed Tarki, who complained that he had worked for that food. However, he only managed to earn the scorn of the others, while Asadin felt he had taken some of the food meant for them and, seeing they also needed food for the adults, he decided to give them some to go. So much kindness caught the attention of a couple of guys who seemed to be from his clan. One of them, an old man who criticized him for being so relaxed when the whole clan was looking for him, revealing himself to be the old chief of Salasma, precisely the person Asadin was looking for. However, the old man wasn't alone, but accompanied by a group from the Courtiser Guild, among them one who was furious because one of his own had been humiliated by Asadin and his servants, assuming he belonged to Sabin, although in the end the old man, Salam, asked them to clear the area so they could talk. Asadin, before leaving, tasked Tarki with scaring away the children, seeing that he knew exactly how to handle them, accusing the old man of eating children, which was enough to make them run for it. Then, Midian and Isma had to drag him away too, and so they left Salam and the MC alone in a sort of makeshift room. Asadin noticed that the place looked identical to what a mere noble would set up, something that bruised the chief's ego, who claimed he would have eliminated him if they weren't in such a public place. However, Asadin suggested that he should investigate Ariel's accomplices. The old man insisted that he himself was one, but the MC flatly denied it, just hoping they would remove the curse. Salam, being arrogant, sees no reason to do so, maintaining the idea that even those years of hatred could be part of a strategy to throw off suspicion. Asadin can only laugh at the thought that someone like him would be useful in a betrayal. No one in the clan would give him information, since he's considered the most despised among them. This logic irritates the old man, who was expecting a more submissive attitude and still doubts why he should help him. Asadin replies that it's the right thing to do, because otherwise, they'll just be eliminating an innocent person without any proof. The old man, still wary, warns him that changing his mind now would make the clan look bad, now that they need to set an example to prevent insurrections. The MC understands that he has become that symbol of power, yet he accepts the old man's conditions, but with one clear demand, that in less than half a year, they lift the curse and his expulsion, putting everything down in a legal document. This pissed off the old geezer, who found it arrogant for an inferior to make such a demand. But Asadin had no intention of trusting his life to some old man's word, which irritated him even more, seeing him as a rebel, one he would gladly eliminate. The MC calmly invited him to try. Salam, believing he was strong enough, accepted the challenge. However, as they were leaving, they both ran into a beautiful woman, who appeared to be the leader of the First Order, Aldous. She was thrilled to see Asadin again, while everyone present made a bow, recognizing her status, especially Salam, who was now acting all submissive, confused by the woman's sudden appearance. You see, Aldous had flown all the way from Iraqi after finding out about the stupid stunt they pulled on Asadin, arriving to tell him that after begging the big boss, she managed to get a contract signed by Hatter and the other elders, handing it to him while holding his hands, which totally ignited Midian's jealousy, as Aldous promised him that in 6 months they would remove the curse, leaving Asadin grateful, who just let the woman keep flirting with him. He treated her with an unusual kindness, which only made Midian even angrier, remembering how he had treated her this whole time. She couldn't understand what kind of relationship they had, since the MC shyly and gratefully accepted everything Aldous said, even when she patted his head like a little boy, surprised by how much he and Ariel had grown, thinking way back to the founding of the Herald Clan by Solia of Arconia, who deciphered the secrets of the grimoire, the beauty of nature, which she presented to the Emperor, allowing the clan to access its full power. That's why the descendants of the clan would have violet eyes just like their matriarch, Arconia, and they named the strongest of each generation the reincarnation of Arconia. In fact, Aldous of the Jadaja clan was recognized with that title, becoming Hatir's disciple and being given the task of deciphering the scriptures of the Divine King. That's how, when she was still just a girl, Aldous and the clan leader discovered the traitor who had taken a copy of the Book of Acre during their investigation, who had given birth in such a way that he could only think it was a curse. Atir, upon finding them, couldn't believe the traitor had managed to hide for so long, lamenting that he hadn't exploited such talent, while Aldous sadly watched the scene unfold, taking the newborns into her arms. With this gesture, Atir immediately realized her intention to protect them, but he wasn't about to let the traitor's bloodline continue. Aldous, trying to convince him, discovered that one of the babies had empty sockets where its eyes should have been, which gave the old man even more reason to want to eliminate him. However, the girl refused, as she felt that incredibly, the eyeless being seemed to be able to see. Atir, knowing the tragic fate of the clan, preferred to eliminate them to spare them from suffering. at least until he noticed that the other baby had violet eyes, the same as Aldous'. That was enough to stop them, although she knew the matter wouldn't end there. During the High Command meeting, they discussed what to do with them. Some argued they should be eliminated to see if they would turn into pages or at least get rid of one of them. The discussion left Aldous in a difficult situation, and Otter knew that regardless of her position, it was unlikely she could save them. That's why she resorted to her last option, giving them a name. This almost made the old man choke on his tea, and he flatly refused. But Aldous was determined, aware of what it meant to give her name to the twins forever. The old man refused, arguing that a descendant of Arconia shouldn't waste her talent in such a way. She, however, didn't seem to care. While the old man couldn't understand Aldous' motives, who saw it as simple, believing firmly that the young ones' lives must be protected, especially if they are descendants of her friend Acre, whose reasons she finally understood for betraying them, which is why she feels no hatred for him. Atir warns her that she shouldn't tell anyone else about this, because she could get into serious trouble. With that said, Adder decides to be the one to name them, naming the boy first, christening him Asadin, the dragon of ruin and infinity, and then the girl, Ariel, the angel who represents light and darkness. The two names come from ancient legends where these figures fought each other until they disappeared. 3 years later, Ariel was already showing a natural talent with the bow, even able to channel mana, which surprised Atir, but Aldous saw something more. She was convinced the little girl was a genius, calling her the best she had ever seen, and although many thought she spoke out of jealousy, Aldous believed Ariel could become the strongest of all the heralds, perhaps even the new reincarnation of Arconia. However, her attention was focused on the crybaby Asadin, who didn't show a single ounce of skill, always running into his sister's arms. Aldous suspected that the curse of service shouldn't have allowed for the birth of twins, which is why all the power was concentrated in Ariel, while the boy received the leftovers, which formed a storm of chaos in his body that prevented him from using magic. Atir lamented that the poor creature hadn't inherited anything, because Ariel had taken both his magic and his eyes, making it clear that Asadin had a very tough future ahead of him. A few years later, the children began learning the teachings of the Haragasa, a race marked by curses and persecution, and because of that, they become a people who relentlessly seek strength, trying to achieve martial perfection. But over time, that ideal becomes twisted, and the pursuit of perfection turns into a blind worship of strength and contempt for the weak. In the midst of all this is Asadin, the most fragile of the group. He earns taunts and beatings from the other children. They only stop because they're afraid of Ariel, who for a long time didn't hesitate to defend him and beat up anyone who dared to bother him. However, as time went on, she stopped caring. She ended up pushing him away, leaving him alone as she continued to grow stronger and stronger. And so, the others saw how Asadin was left completely abandoned, treating him like a total loser. Although he denies it, inside he carries his sadness and rage. One of those days, he escapes to a secluded waterfall to scream until he's out of breath, trying to soothe his pain and frustration. That same day, Alice was climbing that very waterfall, carrying lots of heavy gifts for the children. She finally managed to reach the top, amazed by the beautiful view, but then, a mosquito tried to bite her, and the Emperor's voice from the forest ordered her not to give her blood to impure beings. She obeyed, began to glow, and precisely eliminated every single mosquito. However, the Emperor's voice left out a crucial detail. The boy had fallen into the water. Hearing this, a frantic Aldous immediately jumped in to rescue him. Once she got him to the shore, she desperately tried to revive him until the boy finally woke up, blushing as he found himself in her arms. She, however, hugged him even tighter, worried about why he had jumped into the water. She understood the training was tough, but Asadin had already decided he wouldn't be a herald. That was fine with her, as there were many other paths to take. She focused on keeping him warm so he wouldn't get sick, getting everything ready to watch the stars while she read him a book about fairies. In fact, fairies were beings that existed before the gods, and they were in charge of connecting the constellations. Tucking him in carefully, Aldous lay down next to him and told him the stories. That day was the first time Asadin experienced true beauty thanks to Aldous' sweet smile, which made the stars become his greatest desire. That's why our MC takes advantage of the Solstice Festival they celebrated every 2 years to spend time with her, happily visiting her every day, not noticing that this only managed to annoy Ariel. It was during that time that Aldous gave Asadin the Rescuer Knight's manual, which the little boy enjoyed with excitement and gratitude, telling her he identified with the 3 virtues from the book: courage, wisdom, and compassion. He admired the power and that those knights represented, and he dreamed of being able to use magic someday. Aldous knew well that many of those knights were just phonies, but she liked seeing the way Asadin admired them. Still, she doubted if he truly wanted to be one. Asadin, for his part, was aware of his reality. Not only could he not use magic, but he was also despised by his own clan for being weak. He thought that if the knights ever met him, they would hate him too, and that his face scarred from so much abuse like having a sack put over his head, led him to believe he could never be loved. During one of their conversations, Aldous asked him if he hated her. Asadin, without hesitating, said no. Then, she hugged him tenderly and whispered that if he hated himself, he also hated her, because he was the reason she had to live, since to Aldous, she was like a mother to Asadin. And so, with a calm smile, she reminds him that, according to the book, if he can embrace the three virtues, he can become a rescuer knight. However, as soon as Aldous left, Asadin went back to suffering as usual, this time surrounded by his bullies. But on that particular day, none of them could do anything to him, because Ariel beat them to it, flashing back a little. When Ariel arrived, he pushed the bullies aside, stood furiously in front of Asadin, and yelled at him for pretending to be a weakling, just to get Aldous's attention. His anger grew even more when he saw the book in his hands, ripping it away with a single pull, and no matter how much the protagonist tried to stop her, she just tore it up right in front of him. Desperate, Asadin tries to attack her, but all he gets is a slap. The bullies, frightened by Ariel's intensity, decide to stay out of it. She, however, doesn't stop and throws another accusation at him, claiming he sees Aldous not as a mother, but as a woman. Asadin firmly denies it, but Ariel, with a wicked smile, tells him that when they grow up, Aldous will still be just as young, and she doubts he'll be able to hold back what he feels. Asadin helplessly claws at the dirt, frustrated, knowing how much he cares for Aldous, because it was thanks to her that he truly understood beauty, admiring her deeply. Even if he were to one day desire her, he would deny it, refusing to let his feelings be reduced to something as simple as lust. That reaction was exactly what the ruthless Ariel was looking for, to test if he had any real ambition. Seeing him charge, she met him with a brutal slash right across the face, and although he immediately regretted it, he didn't show it, stating with coldness that he should be grateful, since that scar would make his face less repulsive. For a while, Asadin lived alone in a cabin, burdened by pain and rage, swearing that one day he would get his revenge. That's when he received an unexpected visit from someone who watched the stranger from the doorway and noticed that, despite having no eyes, he had a lot of energy. Asadin reacted instantly, which surprised the hooded figure, who confirmed that the rumors were true. In a calm voice, he said he didn't want to scare him and introduced himself as the Elder Cassis, an elf who was tall with a youthful face. He saw that Asadin's first reaction was to beg not to be eaten, which made the elder burst out laughing, finding it hilarious that the boy knew the old story so well. To calm him down, he assured him that he was on a diet from human flesh, and that, in fact, he should feel honored to have been chosen as his disciple. Smugly, he promised to teach him the Cassis style, a legendary technique. Asadin, however, saw no reason to be happy, aware that he couldn't use magic, so he thought any training would be useless. But Cassis replied with a mocking smile that this style was made precisely for dealing with mages the old-fashioned way, by splitting them in two. He then claimed he had pleaded enough and was going to leave, since he only wanted to help him put his annoying sister in her place. Asadin, realizing this was a real possibility, begged him to stop and accepted him as his master. The elder smiled, pleased, and so we returned to the present, 10 years later, where Aldous was remembering how worried she'd been when she found out about Asadin's elf master. The MC explained to her that Cassis was a pervert and a lunatic, but that in his own way, he was nice, and, besides, he didn't eat humans, which had been one of Aldous's biggest fears for years. That surprised him, as he realized she wasn't the one who had recommended him to the elf. However, for the elder, it was no time for nostalgia, not after what Ariel had done, repeating her father's same mistake. Although Aldous didn't understand the purpose of her actions, the elder supposed it was due to a quest to concentrate power, interpreting the scriptures to gain so much power that no one could stop her. But to Aldous, that was a terrible plan, especially without the complete scriptures. Asadin knew that didn't erase the betrayal, it just proved how wrong she was to devise the plan, and deep down, it didn't surprise him coming from someone of his sister's explosive temper. And so, everyone left the tent under the watchful eyes of the little ones, especially Miriam, who was still jealous seeing the current leader Aldous. Man, Isma couldn't help but acknowledge her beauty, which made Miriam scoff, saying he'd fallen for her charms too. But for Isma, it was different. He could see traces of Jaeger and Aldous, a heritage from the union between the Emperor and a Harrigan. Miriam, on the other hand, was hoping Asadin thought the same thing. Still, Isma felt it was dangerous to follow Asadin in his current state, though Midian didn't get why. He then explained that the clan would most likely soon issue an order to eliminate Ariel, and they might even ask Asadin himself to do it if he wants to prove his loyalty. But the worst part for Isma is that he thinks if that woman really has started a rebellion, she must have a way to break the curse. Miriam was shocked. She didn't expect Isma to seem like he understood Ariel's motives too. In reality, he understood them perfectly. He just didn't want to spill all the beans. He knows Ariel wants to stop the interpretation of the scriptures, aware that even if she manages to free the Harrigans from the curse, the power structure would stay the same, and she, coming from a humble background, wouldn't gain a thing from it. To Midian, however, he only confessed one thing. He's afraid Asadin could be persuaded by his sister. He thinks that despite everything waiting for them, Ariel will end up meeting allies, and Asadin could be one of them. That would make him the perfect spy for the clan. Hearing this, Midian finally understood her friend's fear. If Asadin decides to prove his loyalty to the other side, he might even sacrifice him. But she wasn't worried and full of confidence. She made it clear she would never let that happen. After the night passed, Aldous had to leave despite how little she had slept. Asadin asked her to stay a bit longer to rest, but for her, one night with him was enough. The problem from then on was that, surely, the elders would send the MC to hunt down Ariel to prove his innocence, and she was doubtful about what Asadin would do. He replied that if Aldous asked him to, he would do it, but she cut him off, completely refusing. So Asadin decided to do whatever made her happy unless Ariel attacked her first. Aldous, with her maternal instinct, doubted that would happen. Asadin changed the subject, wanting to give her the pages of the book he had found, but she preferred him to keep them in case he had to negotiate with some crazy herald. But so he wouldn't carry them around loose, she cast a spell that gave him a bracelet, where he could store them, and it also gave him a barrier that repelled the Kurt. With that gift given, Aldous said goodbye, hoping to see him at the Solstice Festival, and that's how his group returned to Salazar, a city full of the hungry and forgotten, where a wave of disappearances had been unleashed, and even several adventurers had fallen. All this according to the Elder's report, which annoyed Asadin since he should have been informed sooner, as the one in charge of the area. Although Midian was grateful that at least they got a carriage out of it, the MC for his part just wanted to get to Tarki's mother's house, who was riding beside him and assured him they were close. Before they arrived, they passed by some crazy guy who was yelling prophecies about the end of the world. This infuriated Midian, who knew he wasn't some enlightened being, but rather someone so miserable he wanted everyone to suffer just like him. But Asadin thought she was being too harsh, thinking humans were idiots by nature and should learn to forgive. So Midian asked him to lead by example with Ariel, but he preferred to accept human imperfection and keep on hating. Isma just watched, noticing how quickly he changed his fortune cookie phrases, but there was no time to chew on them, as they came across something alarming. All the mansions in the area were closed, including Tarki's mother's. He, very upset, told his companions his mom had disappeared. Asadin didn't hesitate and decided to investigate, so the noble chose to force his way in. Once inside, they split up to look for clues. Asadin went with Tarki, who was looking for his mother in her room. However, there seemed to be no sign of anything, until our hero discovered some kind of furball from creatures that were half man and half rat. To the noble's horror, that could only mean one thing. The Kurt known as Mesri, the king of the rats, had been there. Asadin knows full well that the deformed creatures known as ratmen enjoy human flesh, so he doubts the noble's mother is still alive, at least until he notices something strange, cobwebs in a baroness's room. Upon touching one, he feels a faint pulse of magical energy, and he immediately remembers that the mercenary who used to protect Tarki was a Spider-Man, and that makes him suspect the noble's mother was no ordinary woman. On a hunch, he lifts the bed and discovers a secret passageway with a spider symbol engraved on it. Tarki is completely confused, but Asadin immediately understands what it means. He knows that spider Kurts are popular among noble women for their seductive skills, which leads Tarki to conclude that his mother must have been kidnapped for serving another Kurt before they could investigate further. Isma draws the group's attention to something he just found, a safe, which has many gold coins inside. The heralds look at each other, excited by such an easy reward, but Tarki refused to hand them over unless they rescued his mother. Midian considered taking them the old-fashioned way, although Asadin, despite having been expelled, still maintained his honor as a herald, so he refused to loot the place. That's when Tarki found out about his expulsion, while the others concluded that if a follower of Antra had 5 gold coins, she must have been doing something much more important than they imagined. So, they continued their investigation with Tarki, who was getting more and more nervous, until they found remnants of his mother's dress next to a well. Our hero thought it was a passageway, however, going in there was dangerous. But Isma acknowledged that 6 gold coins were enough to justify such a risk. Meanwhile, Asadin had an idea, and so he prepared for the mission and, at the same time, fulfilled one of his dreams, wearing an elegant suit of plate armor, perfect for fighting in tight spaces. They descended with Tarki, holding a candelabra, graduating to their official light source. Inside, they followed the tracks that led them to a fork in the tunnels. While trying to choose a path, Isma almost stepped on a trap, which confirmed there were other people there and, just then, from one of the tunnels, several figures emerged. Asadin resorted to his best talent of pretending to be a noble, with his usual arrogant talk, managing to intimidate them and making the men seem docile. But Tarki soon noticed the greed in their eyes. He immediately recognized them as ratmen. Upon being discovered, the enemies transformed, ready to eliminate them. Tarki, curious, jumped into the attack, but on his first move, he took a claw swipe that damaged his armor. His fury turned to fear, provoking taunts from the rats who pounced on him. Luckily, Asadin pushed him aside and intervened with a single blow, sending one of the creatures flying along with its companions who, upon seeing his strength, began to get terrified seeing the protagonist smiling at the advantage his new, heavy armor gave him. And so, Asadin unleashes on his enemies, hitting them hard. However, as he walks down a path full of crushed bodies, Tarki starts to doubt this method of getting information, although the protagonist, noticing that none of the rat men have said a single word despite the punishment, also begins to believe they know nothing. Still, he manages to get something useful, tattoos with the symbol of Messerine. Just then, the little ones come running to tell them they have found an exit that connects to the river. Following the lead, the group ends up emerging in the middle of a refugee camp. Their appearance draws quite a bit of attention, but they can barely play it cool in their haste. Midian suggests it would be best to investigate the ratmen during the night, although they quickly notice something familiar. The same madman from before, shouting prophecies about the end of the world, although his presence irritates Midian. The crazy guy's words make him wonder if, just as Asadin says, the kidnappings are being carried out through the sewers. The only way to go undiscovered would be to move underneath the large buildings and shelters. That makes the rescue knights suspects. The comment hits a nerve from Asadin's childhood, and he refuses to believe it, but at Midian's insistence, he finally agrees to investigate, managing to convince the local nutjob with a small offering to tell him what he knows. The man mentions a nearby warehouse that was abandoned a long time ago for being considered toxic, though he claims it has a connection to a water channel and a liquor station. It's a strangely specific detail, but enough for Asadin to slowly start accepting something he had refused to believe until that moment. So he ended up approaching the warehouse pretending to be a blind man looking for help, mentioning that he met a man near the tunnels who gave him the seal of the Rat King. The knights were surprised to see him, assuming he was another victim. Although they hesitated, they ended up letting him pass. From the entrance, you can see fresh red stains scattered across the floor. Up above, a priest, barely illuminated by the dim light filtering in from outside, scolds the guards for letting a blind man pass, but when they see the blind man, his expression changes, savoring the fresh meat. The protagonist immediately understands he has fallen into a Messerine's lair. According to the plan, he is supposed to start the fight while his companions advance through the underground tunnels, and, it seems, everything is going according to plan, until a guy suddenly appears in front of him who is huge and muscular and attacks him with a claw. Asadin dodges the blows one after another without difficulty, but the problem is that his cover has just been blown by an old acquaintance, a herald who wants to fight, messing up the plan. One of the guards mentions that the herald's name is Curvin, and he assumes that if he knows the blind man, he must be another soulless heretic. But Asadin, already in a bad mood, knocks him out without a second thought and takes the opportunity to greet his old friend, whom he considers a complete disappointment for having kneeled before Messeri and become his apostle. Curvin doesn't feel an ounce of gratitude towards the emperor who condemned them to his service, bragging that he managed to free himself from that curse of servitude, and now he can eat, enjoy, and do whatever he wants. With an arrogant smile, he decides to finish off the useless Asadin. For the MC, it's sickening to see such a disgusting being who just looks for excuses to unleash his inner beast. That contempt manages to enrage Curvin, who charges at him without hesitation. And so the clash begins, with Asadin falling back from the blows. Curvin gets cocky, confident in his superiority, until suddenly the tables turn. Asadin reveals a monstrous strength, so unexpected that the former herald is left completely confused, with Asadin deciding it was time for revenge. He lifted him onto his shoulders with the solitary house nature style, although it was simply a kind of F5, dropping him face first onto the ground. Curvin is left on the floor, crying, not understanding how something like that could be a technique, but Asadin proves it by repeating the move without mercy. In pain, the former herald orders the rats to defend him. Asadin remains calm, not moving, and as soon as the first one leaps at him, he cuts it down in a single clean motion. The impact, though a cheap shot, cracks his makeshift sword. Curvin notices this detail and sees it as his chance to counterattack. Still confident, he doesn't realize that Asadin is still completely serene, daring him to land the blow if he doesn't want to look like a coward. The provocation works. Curvin, furious, throws his his rat companion, which ends up flying straight toward Asadin. He cuts it down in a single slash, splitting it before it can even touch him. Curvin, thinking that will be enough to distract him, orders all the rats to attack at once. Asadin, now without a sword, resorts to the old-fashioned way, and a single punch is all he needs to run through another simple rat. The knight watches him, stunned, not understanding how Asadin is defeating them so easily, even though they are apostles, but that only makes our hero see him as less than trash. With a swift move, he lands a kick that scrambles all his organs. Curvin, paralyzed with fear, understands. Then that this man didn't get his position through favoritism as he thought, watching as he effortlessly mows down more rats, displaying a power so overwhelming that it places him among the strongest heralds in existence. Curvin doubted this was the same Asadin he remembered, but the MC snapped him out of his thoughts by throwing what was left of a rat at him, knocking him down. From the ground, the former herald tried to beg for his life. Asadin only allowed him a few last words. Desperate, he played the childhood friend's card, which only managed to irritate the MC even more. So, in his desperation, he ended up spilling some info, explaining that deep within the tunnels there was a copy of the Divine King, and that he had been sent to investigate it, but was captured by the rats and forced to join them. The MC then asked him why they were kidnapping people, and Curvin replied that the plagues hadn't manifested yet, so they were trying to activate them by making people with Legium blood suffer in order to release them. For this, they were preparing a ritual, which led the MC to assume that Tarki's mother was one of the victims. The Herald confirmed it, warning him that if he wanted to save her, he had to hurry and free her from those savages, although the MC finds the information interesting, which Curvin insists is classified and hopes that's enough for him to let him go to Sadi Naciente, allowing him to escape. But halfway through his escape, he throws his axe with precision, lodging it in his leg. The wounded ex-herald complains that he said he would let him go. Asadin coldly replies that he only allowed him to start escaping, not that he would succeed, clarifying that he can't afford to leave an apostle of Misery or a traitor alive. So he finishes him off with a single blow. Leaving that behind, he rushes down the damp and smelly corridors, without any backup to stop those savages from escaping. Downstairs, he finds a huge laboratory filled with bodies hanging from the ceiling, and among them, a man strapped to a gurney, and, next to him, a rat in a lab coat preparing some kind of transformation, promising to make him a predator. Just then, Asadin shows up and obliterates the creature with a single punch, mocking how some mere rats dare to call themselves predators. The rat can't believe someone would dare mock Misery, but Asadin fearlessly introduces himself, making it clear he's an Esmeralda. Even so, the creature isn't intimidated and orders the others to attack. One tries to sneak up on him from behind, but Asadin sends it flying with a kick. Next, he faces a lab coat-wearing rat that's crying its eyes out before it's taken out. With that settled, he frees the trapped people and gives them weapons, so that they can defend themselves, asking if they've seen a woman in a red dress. One of the survivors tells him the women are deeper inside, but a murmur spreads through the crowd when they all notice he's one of the Emperor's heralds. Asadin confirms it openly. At first, the revelation sparks fear among the prisoners, but the man thanks him on behalf of the Emperor. The gesture brings a faint smile to our MC's face, and he tells them to escape quickly before more rats show up while he presses on, having matters to attend to deeper below. In a place swarming with rats devouring human remains, a rescuer knight was trying to break through the barriers protecting the pages of the book. Surprised by the immense power stopping him from getting close, he was then interrupted by the MC's arrival. Our MC now understood why there were so many rats. The knight didn't even pay him any attention, dismissing him as mere rat food, while Asadin readied himself for a fight. The knight then unleashes a literal river of rats on him, which our MC starts to exterminate. Still, the sheer number is overwhelming, and he's soon forced to retreat to gain some space. With not many weapons on hand, he decides to use a bow, although he's worried he'll damage it with the strikes he's using to crush the creatures. The knight, watching him fight, is impressed by his skill. He immediately deduces he's up against a herald. Asadin calmly confirms it, suspecting that his opponent must be a corrupt paladin from the Order of Salvation. The knight proudly denies this, stating that he no longer serves any false god or believes in fairy tales about archangels, considering them nothing more than dead gods, who are incapable of comparing to the gods of Kurt. He offers Asadin the chance to join his cause, but ironically, Asadin's faith in the archangels remains unshaken. The confused knight tries to reason with him, insisting that they're just legends, upheld by the nobles to control the people, but that doesn't matter to Asadin. He feels he was saved by the archangels, and no one can break that conviction. The knight realized he wouldn't be able to convince him, so, fed up, he decided to show him who the real gods were. Summoning a pair of giant rats ridden by rat men who charged straight at the MC, he greeted them with a tremendous spinning kick, sending them tumbling spectacularly over each other. Another terrified giant rat thought twice about it, but in the end, it leaped at him, only for Asadin to dodge by spinning through the air and landing with a brutal kick that completely crushed it, placing a foot on the bodies as more small rats began to approach like a river. Then he used his coat to form a kind of funnel that the creatures threw themselves into, falling to the ground. The corrupt knight watched him, astonished, recognizing the power of the heralds, which ironically weakened the barrier on the grimoire's pages. In disbelief that the herald had achieved that effect, he thought that if he eliminated him, the pages would be his, so he prepared to fight as an apostle of Misery. He unleashed a sinister aura with which he released a powerful energy slash that went straight for Asadin, who dodged it. However, he noticed the effect of that energy on a nearby hanging body, which completely rotted, as it absorbed its life force, realizing it was a good idea to dodge. But the corrupt knight didn't stop his attack. Asadin could only keep dodging while trying to save the hanging bodies, managing to rescue a woman. The corrupt knight was surprised to see his true faith, noticing how a herald was saving people. But for Asadin, that should be the normal thing to do, for all humans. However, for the corrupt knight, that kindness was nothing more than a waste of time, aiming directly at the woman in the red dress, while the MC, firm in his conviction, jumped to save her. The impact kicked up a huge cloud of dust, while the corrupt knight lamented that his rival had died like a common dog. However, when the cloud dissipated, he saw with horror that the MC was still completely unharmed, and what's more, he had managed to save the woman, whom he freed from the ropes, much to his enemy's surprise and confusion, who enraged, attacked again, but the protagonist decisively dodged every blow no matter how much the enemy attacked. Eventually, he was unable to keep up with the hero's speed, who moved like a flash, swinging from the ropes on the ceiling, until he managed to hit him and send him into a nosedive. Asadin took the opportunity to land a devastating piledriver. However, in the end he didn't understand why. That guy, even with a broken neck, didn't transform, seeing that those fools are always overconfident. Just then, one of the pages of the book appeared and eradicated the remaining hostile rats before falling into the MC's hands, who now had a total of 3 pages. Despite all the trouble, he continued on, carrying the woman in his arms, thinking that even though he had been expelled, he was still upholding the Emperor's law. And so he walked out of the warehouse, to everyone's surprise. Midian, annoyed, called him out for going in alone. Asadin apologized and explained that he had to improvise when a herald recognized him. Darky, for her part, just wanted to know how her mother was, who had apparently lost consciousness, although in reality she was just faking it, trying not to cause trouble during her rescue. But from here on out, she would start showing off her seductive skills. So the MC, he tried to calm the situation down, but Midian was already super jealous, wanting him to put her down immediately. Dark, on the other hand, was just thrilled to see her safe, completely missing the romantic tension in the air. Later, our MC asked Midian what had happened to the other survivors, and she explained that Ismail had surely escorted them back safely to call the rescuers and let them handle it, since that was one of their warehouses, and so they decided to regroup. Tarky's mother suggested they go to her residence to thank them, and everyone accepted. Once gathered, they all enjoyed some nice tea while chatting. The Baroness immediately recognized her savior's name, which came from ancient legends. Asadin was surprised by how much she knew, but she went even further, deducing that he was a herald, all based on the way he fought. Faced with that, Asadin had no choice but to reveal the reason for his presence, although he did so a bit awkwardly because it was time to get paid. Luckily, Midian mentioned the deal for the 5 gold coins in exchange for saving him, which made everyone wonder how they had gotten so many coins. The Baroness replied that they were family heirlooms, and she had just given one to Tarqui, along with the mercenaries, wondering what had happened to them. Tarqui, embarrassed, couldn't tell the story, so Asadin took over and narrated it. Upon hearing it, the Baroness seemed genuinely surprised by everything that had happened, and she sincerely thanked them for saving her and her son, gladly handing over the remaining coins as a reward and offered them her home for as long as they stayed in the city. Our MC thanked her, though inside he felt confused, seeing how the woman claimed to know nothing about the follower of Antra among the mercenaries she had hired. Despite having a related amulet in her own house, this increased Asadin's suspicions, especially because of her seductive skills, concluding that he needed to watch her more closely. During the night, from the top of a mountain, the kids watched as, back at the warehouse, the rescuers cleaned up the mess they themselves had allowed to happen. They knew that, being a charitable organization, they usually received many donations, even in the worst of times. However, internally, they were extremely wasteful, especially in an area like Salasma, where they also competed with the Academy of the Arts of Wisdom and the Charity Center of Compassion. All those institutions regulated each other, which is why they understood why no one ever found out what was happening in that place. Even so, Isma couldn't help but feel uneasy about the stares he felt coming from the darkness. Midian knew full well there must still be some cultists hiding, so they decided it was best to leave. The next morning, Asadin was exhausted after not sleeping all night, busy checking every possible escape route from the mansion, still distrusting the Baroness. Shortly after, the kids arrived, who also preferred not to tell him much about what they had been investigating on their own, though Midian did mention how she'd seen the servants hauling tons of ingredients, preparing a banquet for someone very special. Isma figured it couldn't be for Asadin, since it would be way too extravagant for a simple breakfast, but to everyone's surprise, it was indeed a luxurious and enormous, ridiculously elegant breakfast. Midian was quick to imply that the Baroness fell for Asadin's charms, He makes it clear he wouldn't get with a buddy's mom. Besides, he's not into older women. Maiden. Maybe it's due to the Spider-Woman's blessing. Just as he was wondering where the Baroness was, Maiden tells him that the Baroness left for the mansion of Margrave Castle. As pretentious as ever, she starts making assumptions. According to rumors, the Margrave is looking for a book with the help of a powerful witch, so according to her, the Baroness has to be that witch. She expects Asadin to praise her for her great deduction, but he doubts it, since if the woman were so powerful, she wouldn't have ended up trapped by a bunch of rats. Even so, he agrees with her that the woman is suspicious and congratulates her with a slight smile, giving her an affectionate pat on the head. That's enough to make Isma jealous. Meanwhile, Asadin thinks about using the wand they had taken from the spider cult to get information and then have a serious talk with the Baroness. However, as evening fell, the woman beat him to it, inviting him for tea in her room. The MC, though pretending to be unconcerned, analyzed her with his inner vision, detecting nothing related to black magic. He then asked her why she had gone to see Herman Gray. She replied that he had called to make sure she was okay after the kidnapping, but in the end, he didn't even receive her, supposedly because he was busy fighting hordes of orcs and goblins that were approaching Salazar. Asadin thought it might be the same faction that he had previously destroyed. If so, the city could be on the brink of a major war, while the Margrave was only thinking about the book. The interrogation changed course when he asked her if she knew how to use magic. She admitted that she did, although very little. Then, he asked her to use the wand that he had found among the remains of the Eskad. The woman claimed she had never seen that artifact before, but she recognized that it could belong to the Fang Eskad or the Horns Eskad. Upon taking the wand, it activated, releasing a magical essence that pointed directly towards the Count's mansion. She now understood that if Asadin looked for the scriptures, he would inevitably encounter the Count. The MC interpreted this as a threat. However, the woman didn't seem to care at all, confessing that she was just a mistress and, even worse, a mistress cast aside for a witch from the Mist Jungle. That left the MC confused, but he couldn't think too much about it, as the Baroness got closer to him, confessing that she would sell the mansion, move to another region, and find a new husband, wanting to help him with anything he needed. As she got closer and closer, Asadin was grateful, though nervous about what he was seeing, realizing that this was actually a love confession where a determined woman threw herself into his arms and with a trembling voice proposed marriage to him. The MC tried to reject her, but she clung to him even tighter. Luckily, at that moment, he heard a voice calling him. He stood up immediately upon recognizing it, thinking it was the Emperor's voice or, rather, a much more sinister presence. The Baroness, confused, didn't understand why he had reacted that way until, behaving like a true gentleman, he rejected her proposal, explaining that his heart already belonged to someone else. This sparked the woman's jealousy, who considered whoever had won him over to be lucky. Asadin assured her that she would also find someone one day, and politely excused himself. That very same night, he came face to face with the speaker of that sinister voice, Ariel's deformed messenger body, although the MC didn't know who it was exactly, so he prepared for a fight. However, the body introduced itself as Ariel's will and delivered a message where his sister asks him to swear loyalty to be only beneath her and above the 10,000. The proposal only disgusted him, finding it absurd that Ariel believed she could conquer the continent when she had already turned against the clan and had been ousted. The body began to deform more and more as it tried to convince him, assuring him that Ariel had managed to break the curse of service. It warned him that no matter how loyal he remained to the Emperor, his curse would never be lifted and that the only salvation was Ariel. Just before exploding, its guts splattered all over Asadin, who just stood there, shocked by the outcome. His power confirmed what he feared. She had now managed to create artificial spirits. Still, he felt she only achieved it using dark magic, and the body's last words left him even more confused, especially with the mention of a sent apostle. The next day, the answer arrived in the form of Rick and his fleet. Asadin suspected they had been allied with Ariel from the very beginning, given the interest the blonde guy had always shown in her. Although in reality, Rick is just in love, he plays it off by saying he follows her because she's an angel of justice, though Asadin ironically reminds him that this same justice was what broke his leg. Rick remains calm and proudly orders his servants to bring him a stool to rest his completely healed leg, boasting that his healing is due to Ariel's power, and claims he feels stronger than ever thanks to her. Asadin only sees it as a pathetic reward for betraying his clan. Rick, offended, replies that Ariel never betrayed them, but that it was the elders and the leader Atir who practiced black magic. He even claims that Kenegal was a vampire, which is why he was executed by Ariel herself, and that's why they saw her as their savior. Although that version made it seem like Ariel was freeing them from magic, Asadin knew that in reality she was also using it. The blonde guy denied it, insisting it was green magic. No matter how much the MC tried to make him see reason, he only received insults in unison from the new fanatics of his sister. Tired of it, Asadin asked if he had come just to talk about her. Rick finally revealed his true purpose, to deliver a letter. The MC hesitated to open it, fearing the immense power his sister now possessed. Still, he had no other choice and broke the seal. However, a sinister presence emerged from inside the letter, transporting them to a dark world where Asadin came face to face with Ariel, although from the outside they only saw him stand still for a second, right before completely crumpling up the letter, irritating the fanatics, though they weren't the only ones, as Asadin could barely contain his fury, making it clear to them that he had already read the message and that he rejected her unacceptable conditions. Ariel's followers were enraged by his arrogance. Rick tried to calm them down, reminding them that they hadn't come to fight and that Ariel was sincerely worried about him. But those words only fueled Asadin's anger, and Rick regretted his attitude, especially after all the favoritism he'd received in the past. But that just convinced our hero to finish him off for good. The others began to prepare for combat, but Rick raised his voice with a firm shout, warning that he wouldn't fight unless attacked. Asadin regretted that things had come to this point and decided against it, simply walking away. Rejecting the offer for the second time, Rick understood and also withdrew, but not before warning him to be careful in that area, because he didn't want to feel responsible if someone ended up dying. With that threat delivered, they left. Still, Rick's men were furious about the treatment they received, wanting to handle the matter personally. Rick reminded them that Asadin's power was much greater now, since he was the one who had eliminated the apostles of Antra. The others insisted it wasn't that big of a deal, but Rick explained the problem wasn't the difficulty, but the convenience. He was planning to wash his hands of the whole thing. To do this, they would use Kosal, whom they had just escorted, hoping the Margrave would take care of our hero for them, without having to get directly involved. Just then, Asadin got some news from Tarqui on the news of Kosal's return. He pretended not to know him but asked for more information. The boy told him that Kosal had been castrated and had lost an eye, arriving there escorted by Cortazar. Our hero understood immediately. That was the threat Rick was referring to. Without wasting time, he woke up the little ones to get ready to leave, even though Midian insisted on staying to enjoy the mansion's comforts, and both Tarqui and his mother were happy to have them there. Still, Asadin knew he had to move fast. He asked Tarqui to thank the Baroness for all her hospitality, but the boy suggested he do it in person. Our hero preferred to avoid another romantic scene, which made Tarqui suspicious, although our hero chose not to mention he almost became his stepfather. And with that, Asadin said his goodbyes. He had enjoyed the journey with the boy, who hoped they could meet again someday. As evening fell, our hero and his companions were looking for a way into Castle's fortress. However, the place was extremely well fortified, with all its perimeters sealed and heavily guarded. Midian suggested asking the Baroness for help, but Asadin knew that with Kosal and his mother keeping an eye on the Norm's movements, they would only be putting the family in danger. He figured the best option was to find some tools to break through the walls and get in on their own. But that's when they ran into two old problems. Although right now, they were more like solutions. The King's Knights, Beck and Maya, who suddenly appeared before them. He approached them with a big smile. Flashing back a bit, Maya and Beck were walking together. Beck accepts that he'll have to become a penitent knight in the end, something Maya considered unfair, because if it weren't for him, Gossel would have survived. For Beck, however, spending the rest of his life dressed in white and protecting the borders didn't seem like such a bad fate. Just then, a burly and clearly agitated guy shows up, introducing himself as Belden. Well, it seems he needs Beck's help with something urgent. He explains that Kosal isn't worried about anything, but that he'd rather go blind again than let Tarqui move up in the line of succession. So in a childish fit of desperation, he's hiring mercenaries to go after the Baroness. Northbell asks Beck to help him round up refugees for the job, hoping that if he intervenes, he can at least protect the Baroness, thinking his popularity might help free him from his sentence as a penitent. However, Beck had zero desire to get involved, not wanting to take part in another absurd mission that would only lead more innocents to a pointless death. Remembering Asadin's words about how a person's worth should be measured by their actions, not their words. That memory only convinced him to stay out of it, until to his surprise, that very memory materialized right in front of them, even as a very excited Maya ran to greet Asadin and his group. To Beck's surprise, she told him they had been a huge help during the disaster caused by the black magic. He, bewildered, then realized that she had no idea the man was a herald. Asadin, for his part, spoke naturally and straight to the point, expressing his desire to join the mercenaries, quickly convincing Belden that he was a better option than recruiting useless refugees, leaving everyone there perplexed by his proposal, especially Beck, who didn't understand why he suddenly wanted to serve Kosal. The reason is that this way, they easily managed to infiltrate the castle, but they still had to remain vigilant while waiting for the eunuch's arrival, although as soon as our MC entered a room, he sensed an unsettling essence of blood and black magic spreading throughout the place. That's when the annoying, nearly blind noble appeared, furious about having to personally receive the mercenaries, especially when, according to him, they charged way too much. Kosal looks even more annoyed upon noticing that all this fuss was just for one mercenary. Asadin, without losing his cool, replies that he should prefer quality over quantity and that he doesn't need an army to— His words are enough to ignite the noble's fury, who immediately orders his guards to attack them, but Asadin easily stops them in a matter of seconds, disarming them and knocking them unconscious with impeccable precision, showing tremendous mastery with every kick. He then grabs the weapon still floating in the air and with a single move that violently stirs the wind, points it directly at Kosal's neck. His message is clear. If he wanted to, he'd already be dead. The pale and trembling noble admits it, so he asks what his price is for getting involved in a conflict between nobles. Asadin thinks for a moment and decides that if he's going to do it, he's going to go big, and says there is a more effective way to secure his line of succession without having to confront Tarki by having his mother rise to the position. In short, he asked for permission to directly attack Mangrove Castle. The response was a huge laugh from the noble, who decided to accept the deal upon seeing Asadin's audacity and guts and ordered a room to be prepared for him to wait in while his mother arrived, planning to take advantage of his skills. RMC pretended it was an honor to serve him. So, while waiting at the inn, Asadin was cleaning a new sword, and Maya, by his side, admired his cleverness for having pulled it off. That the hunt for Castle, his main objective, was practically served to him on a silver platter, since he possessed pages of the grimoire. Besides, with their trick, they had managed to inspect the castle, the first step in executing their plan. Still, Asadin asked him not to get too confident, as he suspected Castle might be playing them. But as long as nothing happened, he preferred to enjoy the expensive and sharp sword they had gifted the nobleman. Even so, he confessed that he missed the emperor's voice that used to watch over his targets. Isma, smiling, said he had just the thing for that, took out a piece of paper, and using magic, began to fold it precisely until it took the shape of a small bird. Then, with a touch of energy, he made it fly using origami magic. The protagonist was surprised that the boy could use such an advanced spell. Isma, in turn, was surprised that Asadin didn't even know about that type of magic. Knowing he wasn't able to use it, the protagonist admitted it, thanking him for his help in making up for his shortcomings. That acknowledgement moved Isma deeply until Maiden ruined the moment, with the excuse that Asadin's maturity could hurt him, reminding Isma of his inferiority complex regarding the protagonist, which in the end actually hurt him even more. Asadin, seeing the poor boy's pride, in agony, begged the cruel girl to shut up, so he changed the subject, pulling out a blueprint given to him by Belmont to analyze how they would enter the castle. Isma assumed they would act that very night, but the protagonist expressed his concern for Rick and the others, who he had seen were too calm despite his provocations. He feared what they might be planning. Unfortunately, his suspicions were confirmed immediately when Isma's paper bird observed a large part of the Count's troops moving towards the northern residence. Asadin then understood that they had been found out. Seeing that the target was the Baroness, he couldn't let them hurt her after everything she had done for them, so he decided to act. Isma watched him with resignation, knowing that Asadin always chose the harder path, but the protagonist replied that the duty of a herald was to protect people, in addition to following his personal convictions. Isma assumed they would go directly to save the Commander, Baroness, but Asadin had another plan: cut off the monster's head first. In other words, they would go for Castle. And so, their attack began. Meanwhile, at the North Mansion, the Baroness's guards were being brutally beaten as the servants watched helplessly. In the hall, the Baroness herself felt like a prisoner in her own home. Although the knight in charge assured her it was all for her safety, it infuriated her, as she felt just as protected as when she was kidnapped. The knight took advantage of her annoyance to interrogate her, asking if on that occasion she had allowed a suspicious person to enter. The Baroness was outraged that he would call the hero, who had rescued her and defeated the misery that. The knight, very seriously, replied that to him, he was just a rat that had eaten another, threatening her by saying that if she continued to protect him, there would be consequences. She trembled at his words, but everything changed when a guard burst in alarm to inform him that Castle's castle is on fire. In flames, courtesy of Asadin's first move, and in this way the servants, was containing the flames while they rescued the most valuable belongings. From a distance, the protagonist watched the spectacle, admitting how creative the homicidal side of humanity could be. Although he regretted not having his own magic, he still had to focus on his mission, turning all his attention to a nearby annex which he discreetly approached. Upon arriving, he noticed the place was completely empty, but flooded with a strong smell of blood. Fierce monsters began to emerge from the shadows. Asadin leaped and with just 2 arrows took down the creatures, thinking that perhaps they were the ones who had devoured the guards. However, as he got closer, enormous eyes opened behind him, glowing with a red light that set off a clear warning sign. It was undoubtedly a trap. Suddenly, a zombie guard lunged at him, the first of a horde that began to pour out from the shadows. Asadin didn't want to waste time, so instead, he ran straight inside the building. Inside, the black magic spell grew increasingly stronger. Asadin was surprised by the level of power emanating from the Count's mistress, though he was thankful to have left the zombies behind. If he hadn't, he probably would have been fighting zombies until dawn without a break, staying out of the line of sight of the undead. He followed the trail of evil energy to a large door, throwing it open, only to find 3 men performing a repulsive ritual. The sorcerers were enraged at being interrupted, and Asadin responded without hesitation, firing 2 arrows that embedded themselves in the foreheads of the first 2. Then he advanced on the last one, hoping to get information in exchange for his life. However, the guy mocked him, calling him an inferior being and claiming that just by transforming, he could easily kill him. A transformation that took way too long, so an impatient Asadin finished him off with 1 slash and muttered in annoyance that if you're going to transform, you should do it quickly. Continuing on his way, guided by the ever-intensifying smell of blood, he couldn't understand how a nobleman could be responsible for something so grotesque. Opening another door, he found a river of blood flowing through the room. In the middle of it, the Count was bathing calmly, accompanied by 2 snake women. The protagonist was horrified at the sight and fired immediately, but his arrows only illuminated the lustful and macabre scene for a fleeting moment. Asadin realized he was in trouble as the trio stood up and the nobleman, feeling his bath was interrupted, his bloody bath, smiled arrogantly and began to slowly approach him. Kaysar was surprised to see such a brave assassin standing before him, although to Asadin the nobleman was nothing more than a pathetic being, and the only thing that really bothered him was seeing his disgusting habits on full display, wishing he would just get back in the bath. Kaysar, amused by his insolence, wondered if he was as well endowed as he was arrogant. Asadin replied with a sarcastic smile, reminding him that he almost hooked up with one of his wives. The man burst out laughing. Impressed by his audacity and courage, Kaysar proposed that he abandon the emperor and his current employer to join him, promising him eternal life. But for Asadin, those kinds of promises weren't his style, and they certainly didn't align with his ideals. He sighed, lamenting that he couldn't make use of his talent, and snapped his fingers, immediately forming a whirlpool of blood from which ancient fallen heralds emerged. Asadin is stunned to see them aiming arrows at him, despite their cadaverous and trembling hands. The resurrected heralds display impressive precision and power. Asadin dodges as best he can, surprised by how well they can still fight, as 2 new shots fly straight at him with no chance of escape. He takes the hit, staggering back several steps, but to the resurrected herald's surprise, he manages to stop both shots. The outcome leaves them baffled, and they decide to up the ante. They then unleashed a wave of blood with their swords. The protagonist, seeing he couldn't dodge it, charged straight ahead, slicing through the crimson tide until he was face to face with one of them. However, that dead warrior laughed, revealing that he had led him into a trap. From the blood surrounding him, another resurrected warrior emerged. This one threw a dagger that Asadin dodged, causing the weapon to hit his own comrade. The MC took advantage of that moment to strike him hard, sending him flying, and then quickly created some distance, firing the arrows he had caught with his own hands, hitting vital points, thinking it was all over. However, the resurrected ones got up again. Asadin realized that in their state, they no longer even felt pain. He saw them as mere zombies, although they called themselves vampires, boasting that thanks to the man Grave they had abandoned the foolish emperor's mission. To Asadin, this was nothing but pure corruption. He found it even more pathetic to see them drinking the filthy blood at the bottom of a tub, declaring with a firm voice that the heralds must follow their own path and that there was no room for mercy for traitors. He then adopted the Casus-style stance. The resurrected ones called him arrogant and launched their attack, but their best offensive was not only easily blocked, but Asadin also unleashed an electric shock so powerful it sent them flying through the air, leaving them paralyzed. Seeing them lying on the ground in disgrace, Asadin lamented that they dared to call themselves heralds, being mere monsters without a warrior's pride. He yelled at them to fight with everything they had left, if they still remembered what honor was. His words shook them, and they accepted that he was right. They stood up, determined to die with dignity, and concentrated all their energy, forming a massive whirlwind of blood, from which 2 colossal crocodiles emerged, ready to fight with all their might. Asadin watches them with a smile, thinking this is how it should have been from the very beginning.